Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. Today is Friday, March 1st. I'd like to welcome you to the Gene Harvey Community Center. If you will please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll now ask Emma if you will please lead us in roll call.
Yes, Madam Chair. I will begin with the roll call of the council members in person. Councilmember Burgess. Here. Councilmember Damrell. Councilmember Hueso.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Moranian.
Here.
Chair Madueña.
Here.
I will now do the roll call of our virtual council member, Councilmember Zingali.
Here.
And do you have anyone over the age of 18 in the room with you?
No, I do not.
What just happened is we are now following the new rules in accordance with the newly adopted Bagley Clean requirements. So we have to do two roll calls, in essence, one for those council members that are in person and those that are participating remotely. And for that, I'd like to say good morning to Councilmember Zingali.
Good morning. I hope you're feeling better this morning.
Thank you. Okay, we will now move on to item 3, public comment. And this item is for the public to comment on items that are not on the council's agenda. Again, any comments taken during this time, any comments on the items on the agenda will be taken during that time. Emma, do we have any public comment?
We do. But first, I just wanted to let anybody else know if any member of the public is interested in providing public comment on any agenda item during today's meeting. Please send an email blue card to engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. As seen on the screen, be sure to note your name and the agenda item you wish to speak on. You may also raise your hand on Zoom, and when called, the clerk will unmute you. And we have a general public comment from John Herrick.
Thank you. John Herrick, South Delta Water Agency. I did not win $500 million last night. That is not why I'm here. I just want to give you an update on what's going on in the South Delta very briefly. Last year's high flows don't silt in our channels. They increase the siltation in the channel. And so in August, when we still had high flows, we thought, okay, everything's fine because we had 5 CFS at Vernalis. And I started getting calls from people on Middle River that they didn't have water. Water levels were too low to irrigate. And so that was a shock to everybody. DWR and South Delta kind of looked at it the best we could. DWR determined that although there was 4,000 CFS going down Old River, instead of half of that or 2/3 of that, or one third going down Middle River, only 200 CFS was going down Middle River. So that meant that there was a hump of silt in the head of Middle River. So this past fall, I got a text that had a video from one of the local farmers, and it was of Middle River at Undine Road Bridge. That doesn't mean anything to you, but between Roberts Island and Union Island. And the video showed instead of a channel being 30 yards across and 4 to 6 feet deep, it showed a channel that was 1 yard across and maybe 3 feet or 6 inches deep. So when we saw that, we thought, we're in big trouble. So although we have a long-term dredging program proposed as part of a larger project, we're trying to figure out some emergency actions that might be taken without getting anybody thrown in jail, because it appears that we're going to reach this summer and there will be insufficient water flowing in Middle River for the local diverters. That's thousands of acres, if not 10,000s of acres. And so we're kind of sweating it down there. That's not your problem, but I want you to be aware of the severity of the siltation problem in the South Delta. In a few years, if we're not able to do something, it will start putting a lot of people out of business. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Dominic Gooley. I'm a civil engineer representing various reclamation districts. I've worked in the Delta since 1992, over 30 years, and back then our levees were a lot lower. And as I drove over here looking at the juicies there, you see a orange splash cap there. And back in those days, we had splash caps on Twitchell Island specifically because the levees were below the floodplain. And the splash cap did its job. It's let the water splash over, and the levee was a lot lower, and the Delta was a lot more susceptible to flooding back then. And through the DWR, there's been a significant investment, and the levees are a lot better, and especially the East Bed Mud Aqueduct levees that I represent through the investment of the prior bonds. They're all up to the PL 8499 standard for the most part, and they're very safe levees. The last time I spoke here was on the Delta Levee Investment and Strategy. And one of the highest priorities for you guys is the 200-year level of protection for urban levees. Now, all of the urban levees have 100-year protection certified by FEMA, and that's a very high standard. It's a lot higher than the standards that the Delta is up in. So I think you need to account for or reconsider investing so much money to achieve, a very low increment of flood protection to the 200-year, and you should invest more in the Delta because, as you're going to see today, with climate change and the opportunity that additional water is going to be, there's opportunities to solve this problem and have more water resiliency by storing the water upstream. So because this item's not on the agenda, I think you should reconsider the investment strategy to have such a high priority to go from 100-year protection to 200-year protection and invest that money, I'll say specifically in Terminus Track where Highway 12 is, because that needs a lot of money to get it up to a standard because we're only at the HMP standard, and that's a very large island. It's right next to Bolden Island, and it has Highway 12 through it. And it'd be a lot better to spend money there than in the city of Stockton, where we already have 100-year flood protection. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. We are very excited to spend the morning talking about our draft Delta Adapts climate adaptation strategies. We have spent the better part of the last 6 years on this initiative, working to better understand the risks associated with climate change and what it brings to the Delta and the solutions needed to address them. As we approach the major milestone of having a public draft of our adaptation plan, today's discussion will help us collectively understand and get behind the actions needed to, again, make this happen and to protect the Delta that we know and that we love. As we know, climate change already impacts all of us, and it is the core of our agency's mission and everything we do as an agency. Today, we're going to get to hear from our Delta Adapts Council staff team, as well as 4 implementing partners that will discuss how their work aligns with one or more of our strategies. We will have ample time for comments and questions from both our council members and members of the audience, both in person and those that are online, in between each segment of the discussion. I'll now hand it over to Jeff Henderson, Deputy Executive Officer for Planning and Performance, and to Morgan Chow, Senior Environmental Planner.
Great. Thank you, Chair Madueño, and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many here as well as online. We're really, really excited to be here today, and we want to thank everyone who's here and online for joining us and making this a priority for your day. As a reminder, Delta Adapts is the Council's climate adaptation initiative that we've been leading since 2018, with a goal to better understand specific risks to the Delta and propose strategies to prepare accordingly. This is significant work. It's the first plan for the region that cuts across multiple sectors or topics. Other plans have been made at the local level or addressing a single topic like water supply, ecosystem, flooding, or agriculture. Delta Adapts is a framework for making much needed actions happen in the region, and the need is urgent and the time is now. This work is being led by the Stewardship Council, which was created to help safeguard Delta assets, and the Delta Plan and the Council have had a significant role in adaptation planning from the beginning. We'll touch on examples of this throughout our time together today. The adaptation strategies you'll hear about today are the result of many years of conversations across a very diverse group of interests and expertise. This work recognizes a lot of great progress in protecting the Delta, but we still need to work together, be innovative, and set priorities to keep up with anticipated impacts. In our strategies, we've identified needs, resources, partnerships, and leaders, as we recognize that much of the plan will be accomplished by others. So I'd now like to introduce the staff who is going to be assisting us today. To my left is Morgan Chow with the Council, who's been leading this project for the past few months. To my right is Beck Barter, our Director of Public Participation, who will be helping moderate today's discussion. I'd also like to recognize Dan Constable, Environmental Program Manager with the Council, Annie Merritt, who's in the front row, Environmental Scientist with the Council, and also introduce Liz Ramos with KSN and Campbell Ingram with the Delta Conservancy, who Dan will introduce a little more detailed in a bit later. I also want to recognize other members of our project team that are here in the first row to assist with questions today. Aaron Mullen, our lead engineer, Ashok Batula, Senior Water Resource Engineer, James Edwards, Senior Water Resource Engineer, with Chris Kwan, Senior Environmental Scientist, Charnel Wycliffe, our Sea Grant Fellow, and I'd also like to acknowledge the large team that's contributed to Delta Adapts over the last 6 years, many of whom are joining us today, with a special recognition to Harriet Ross, Corey Copeland, Andrew Schwartz, and Avery Livengood, who had significant roles in this project. We're also supported by a consultant team from AECOM, and the Delta Science Program has provided valuable input for the team. Our objectives for today are to provide a preview of the draft adaptation strategies. Morgan and I will provide an overview of the project, and then Dan and Annie will introduce the strategies. For each focus area, we're joined by guest presenters who will speak to how one or more of the proposed strategies relates to their ongoing work. After each presentation, we've allotted time for questions and comments from council members and questions and comments from the audience here today, as well as those who are joining us on Zoom. Our goal is for council members and those in the audience to leave with a solid foundation for reviewing the upcoming plan and to hear some initial feedback and discussion around what it will take to implement the strategies. Next slide, please. Got it. Okay. Oh, now I got to back up. Great. Okay, Delta Adapts is a two-phase initiative. We're here today to talk about the second phase. The first phase, which began in 2018 and was completed in 2021, was a vulnerability assessment that we used to identify the assets, the resources, and the people most at risk from climate change in the Delta. We learned the following. 1, flood risk. Flood risk is one of the most pressing threats to the Delta. It's going to continue to worsen in the future with changes in sea levels, precipitation, hydrology, and temperatures. These impacts will not be experienced by all Delta residents equally, and they will affect the central and southern Delta the most, with a concentration in the Stockton area. Many of the residents potentially exposed to flooding in these areas may have a higher sensitivity to flood impacts and a lower capacity to adapt. Delta water exports will be less reliable in the future due to climate change. The existing water supply system does not provide enough storage to capture anticipated increases in runoff due to more variable precipitation. In terms of water quality, in-Delta water uses may be threatened by episodic water quality declines, with future droughts potentially exposing more acres of the Delta and more acres of Delta agriculture to more salty water than has historically occurred. Delta ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change, They'll continue to be stressed and will have little room to migrate or adapt. Agricultural production trends will shift due to climate change. Increasing temperatures and the number of extreme heat days are projected to reduce yields for many Delta crops. And the number of extreme heat days will increase Delta-wide. The communities identified as most vulnerable to extreme heat are in Stockton and Tracy. Now, we acknowledge that many of these findings don't identify necessarily new problems. The Delta has experienced these challenges for decades, but climate change is already making some of these problems worse, and it presents new opportunities to access funding, leverage science, and draw attention to address them. That's really the foundation of why we're here today. I'll now turn it over to Morgan to describe phase 2 of Delta Adapt. Morgan.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, Chair, council members, and everyone in the audience and online. I'll talk a little bit more about what went into phase 2, which is our adaptation plan, which includes a range of actions to improve regional resilience to what Jeff just described. Next slide, please. So for the development of our plan, we leaned on diverse interests and groups and input, and also our vulnerability assessment findings, which Jeff just summarized, to explore both adaptation needs, priorities, and then to develop a suite of strategies to address those. As Jeff said, we've been working in focus areas, agriculture, flood risk reduction, ecosystem, and water supply reliability for the last 2.5 years approximately, and working to integrate equity throughout. This figure that you see summarizes our engagement, which began in 2021 with a workshop series that we co-hosted with a group of community organizations in Stockton, and engagement with community organizations has continued over the last several years, both formally in groups like our environmental and tribal justice expert group, and also informally through council-hosted forums and several meetings and community events. Another critical component of our outreach for this plan has been reaching and hearing directly from Delta farmers and growers. We heard firsthand about challenges growers are grappling with, how they're adapting already, and what they need to further adapt. We also held a series of meetings with our technical focus groups for those focus areas, and also our interdisciplinary stakeholder work group. As you heard yesterday from Brandon Chapin, we've incorporated several components from tribal consultations, as well as informal meetings with other state, local flood and water agencies. We've also listened and heard from council-led forums on topics such as adaptive management, salinity management, restoration, and others. And finally, with the recent completion of the Delta resident survey, we've learned a lot about how Delta residents at large feel about various climate risks and also adaptation options. And all of this has really informed the plan that we're working towards having a public draft for. And as Jeff mentioned, the public draft is coming soon. We're aiming for this spring. And as we approach having the draft, we're really spending a concerted effort in the locations that have scored the highest in terms of social vulnerability to climate impacts. So those specific areas we're focusing on are Antioch, Pittsburgh, and Stockton. Next slide. A bit more about the components of the forthcoming plan. Our strategies are both physical and management level actions. They cut across multiple focus areas and will be realized differently depending on the specific location in Delta. Each strategy has a lead entity according to the organization that makes the most sense to lead, not necessarily by their regulatory authority, and several partners, and Dan and Annie will speak more to these when they come up. We also highlight strategies that we feel according to cost, what needs to happen soon, and other factors that should be implemented like in the near term. We identify adaptation costs and potential financing mechanisms that Jeff will touch on later today. We also note, as Jeff mentioned, where strategies that relate to what is already in our Delta plan, as well as other state, regional, and resource-specific plans, and how we're building on those. We'll include several case studies, which really highlight projects and approaches that are in line with what we're calling for in our strategies and what we want to see more of moving forward. And then lastly, we discussed that, certain decisions, especially with land use decisions, have significant trade-offs that need to be considered. And that's, one more slide, next slide. And lastly, before I turn it over to Dan, I'll just touch on how we're incorporating equity into our adaptation strategies. Our council, our ongoing environmental and tribal justice work has significantly informed the equity components of our plan. And here are some of the main ways that equity shows up in our strategies. First is through representational justice. So in many of our proposed actions, it's increasingly important to work towards having decisions and respective decision-making bodies represent the communities that they serve, ensuring communities that are most impacted by decisions are informed, represented, and involved in the process. This includes partnering with tribes and community organizations, improving engagement by building trust early and having sustained interactions. Prioritization of investments, so considering who faces the most risk and who needs the investments the most. So this includes things like increasing access and green space in areas that have the least, particularly in urban communities, in terms of tree cover, impervious surfaces, and vulnerability to extreme heat. Prioritizing levee investments and building flood resilience in areas with the highest flood risk. Often those areas also have low flood insurance rates, low access to suitable housing, and additional challenges for evacuation. And then supporting small water systems, such as those that rely on wells for drinking water. And lastly, the need to amplify risk communication and education efforts to reach socially vulnerable communities has come up across the board for all of our strategies on topics such as flood risk, awareness around Delta agriculture, clear communication on the benefits and costs associated with restoration, and the need to promote broader water conservation and water storage needs. So that's it for me. I'll hand it over to Dan to tee up our strategies. Next slide.
I'll just interject.
Oh, sorry.
So we're really excited to engage with you all today. Please note that we will have about 10 minutes of discussion time after each panel item. And please only comment once per panel discussion period. In order to stick to the timeline, we're going to provide a 3-minute timer. You'll see it on the screen as you're talking, just to help pace yourself. If your comments do exceed the timer, you might be asked to continue the conversation offline. Our council staff is available to have follow-up conversations after the meeting. So now I'd just like to open it up to council members if you had any thoughts on the overview. No? Emma, is there anyone online that would like to, or I'm so sorry, is there anyone in the room that would like to make a public comment for the general presentation? And Emma, do we have anybody online that would like to participate?
No, we do not.
Excellent.
Oh, but we have a hand from Councilmember Zingali.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. I thought I would just put this out there preemptively rather than ask the question every section. So my understanding is that the equity considerations are embedded in each of the strategies. How governance, how each of these issues, water supply, agricultural strategies would affect vulnerable communities. So rather than my asking after each section, what specifically is the equity component of that? Can I just put that out there on the front end and ask that as you go through the strategies, please address specifically how the strategy incorporates equity?
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Zingal. I think we can provide some examples throughout.
And we also have an online comment from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, I did want to raise the issue with environmental justice that the council has been using screening tools that are based on definitions of environmental justice communities that there have pollution. And the issue is that the North Delta legacy communities don't meet those criteria because the environment isn't degraded yet, but they are very climate vulnerable. And it was an issue with the council Delta levy investment strategy. They manually adjusted for Stockton because it did meet the screening criteria, but they didn't consider the legacy communities because they didn't show up on the screen. And I'm not sure if anybody from those communities was actually involved in the discussion. But obviously it affects them, and they do have to, they currently, a lot of the levees, they have to flood fight every time there's high water. So it's a huge issue. And I'm wondering how you addressed representation of legacy communities in this process.
Thank you for your comment. Emma, do we have anyone else that would like to comment on the first panel?
Yes, we do. We have Kathy Schaefer. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, this is Kathy Schaefer. I'm a PhD.
Kathy, I think we lost you. Can you hear us?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry. My name is Kathy Schaefer. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis, and I just want to point out that the studies are showing that the NFIP insurance program is increasingly unaffordable for many households, particularly low-income households in the Delta. And I just want to encourage you to think about other strategies in addition to raising awareness on flood insurance, because if it's unaffordable, that may not be an option for many households. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Emma, is there anyone else that would like to contribute to the conversation?
No, there's not.
Excellent. Okay, at this time, I'll turn it over to Dan Constable.
Okay. Good morning, Chair, Council members, and thank you to all our participants here in person, online once again. I'm going to talk and kick us off on our flood risk reduction strategy. This is a critical area of importance to the Delta. I think everyone here knows this is an area where we got significant and consistent feedback that we needed to look at this. And just drawing your attention to the slide here from left to right, it works from our vulnerabilities that were identified under phase 1 of the project to a subset or a selection of our 9 strategies on flood risk reduction, and then some example actions. Again, not listing all the actions, just in the interest of time. Going back to the vulnerabilities, some of the areas that we found under this strategy, under flood risk reduction, is that climate change is going to affect the Delta from all sides. So that means changes in intensification of the hydrologic patterns, change riverine inflows, tidal surge, sea level rise, and a necessary action that we would need to change our operations and water management to help address that. The other factor, as Jeff mentioned, is that flooding affects everyone in the Delta, but it affects us differentially. And so that's a big issue, to getting to your point, Councilmember Zangali, about equity of how we address that. As laid out from left to right here, we'll go through these. I also wanted to note, and I think this has been brought up, that flood risk remains a major vulnerability, but it's less than it would have been without the significant investment that's gone into it. So we've made significant improvements, yet there's still much work that needs to be done, and climate change is making that more and more necessary. So we've made progress, but we have more to do. Another point that's come up under this as part of our strategies overall is the importance of levees. We've heard time and time again that levees can be a cost-effective way to help reduce flood risk, along with other strategies. They can be cost-effective when done appropriately, and they work up to a point. And so we're continuing to advocate for the importance of levees. Just to give us some examples of strategies here, I'm also wanting to note that these are built on and go beyond what's in the Delta Plan. So we currently have 4 regulatory policies in the Delta Plan that are also aligned with this. This includes RRP1, which guides investments in levies and emphasizes emergency preparedness. This is aligned with our Delta Levies Investment Strategy, or DLIS. There's ERP4, which supports flood management related to levee projects and land use. It essentially looks at evaluating levee setbacks. And there's DPP1 and DPP2, which are 2 regulatory policies that emphasize the importance of making sure we do not develop in at-risk areas in the Delta, curb development, and respect local land uses. The strategies we have are intended to address the challenges posed by a more variable hydrology, and a key focus is on ensuring equity in decision-making and the ability to incorporate new climate data as we go forward. Also want to note that these strategies prioritize non-structural alternatives and projects that bring in multiple benefits. So again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to walk through a few of these, and the full set will be out later this spring. Our first flood strategy is FL1, is titled Develop a Comprehensive Climate-Informed Understanding of Flood Dynamics in the Delta. And this includes 4 sub-actions. Broadly, to summarize these include actions such as updating our modeling to use more recent hydrology and forward-looking hydrology. We know that's out of date in many places. It gets a bit technical, but we need to update what we're doing to have a better understanding of the system moving forward. And a lead on this is proposed as the council as a convener. Another strategy we have, strategy 2, is to improve and modernize levees based on asset importance and vulnerability. For a suggested lead, we have the Department of Water Resources on this, and an example action under this focuses on integrating climate risks and equity into DLIS. This strategy includes actions such as improving flood emergency preparedness. It's non-structural. Another strategy under this, and an action under this, is to raise awareness about the availability and importance of flood insurance, and Liz is going to talk more about that in a moment. Together, the full set of strategies, again, built on the Delta's ongoing progress and partnerships, and they reflect an understanding of flood risks derived from modeling, stakeholder input, and all the feedback that we've gotten from our focus group and technical advisory members over the past few years. By emphasizing flexible, multi-benefit approaches, these strategies offer a comprehensive method for flood risk management, bolstering ecosystem health, and bringing in community support while addressing climate change. During our focus groups, we heard from many partners about the importance of reducing flood risk and the role of levees in the Delta, and we're trying to incorporate that into all of our strategies. Our next speaker is going to speak about aspects of the work that are relevant to these areas, that is reducing flood risk and emergency preparedness. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth, or Liz Ramos. Liz is a civil engineer at KSN Engineers. She's also a Delta native, so she knows the area very, very well. She has extensive experience in emergency preparedness. Liz will highlight her work relevant to levee strengthening, emergency preparedness, and risk communication. Okay, over to you, Liz.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, council members. Next slide, please. Liz Ramos with KSN Civil Engineer. I've been with KSN for 10 years, and over those 10 years, I've been primarily focused on emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. So thank you for letting me come and speak about this really important topic. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, there are several tools in our emergency preparedness toolkit, and I'm going to highlight several of them. But within the lens of looking at the future and how we need to adapt this for the future, it's important to understand the work that we've done and where we are today so that we can have a good understanding of where we go from here. Next slide, please. So the first tool is, of course, arguably one of the most important, and that is to invest in our first line of defense, so the levees themselves. And on the screen, you see this graph that I think illustrates this point really well. This reflects the Delta Subventions Program, and the Delta Subvention Program supports continued maintenance of our levees in the Delta. On the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, on the red, we have the cumulative failures over time, and on the right, we have invested dollars. If I could focus your attention on that red line, we could see that at the time where these investments began, after the 86 floods and driven by Bulletin 19282, we can see that line flatten. So that indicates that there were no levee failures or breaches. Those flat lines occur, over the time when those investments are happening, so over those green bars. And this really shows, I think, how making sure that we're keeping up with our maintenance and the levees are performing day to day, certainly, but also during high water events is an important thing that we have to keep doing. Next slide, please. Okay. The second item is flood emergency preparedness. And that has two really key components. It has the flood fight effort, which we're all probably really familiar with. We have our technical experts, our districts, our levee patrollers. We want those folks to be focused on the levee. But we also have this public safety effort. This is a different group of people. This is sheriff, this is police, County Office of Emergency Services. And during an event, it is really important that these two groups who don't work together day to day be able to work very well, very quickly when they need to. Next slide, please. Excuse me. And that was something that San Joaquin County recognized in 1997 under the leadership of Ron Baldwin, who was the Director of Emergency Services for San Joaquin County at the time. He felt like he needed to work with the districts, the reclamation districts, to develop flood safety plans that would, number one, help the districts document what they do, but also learn and formalize how they work with their public safety partners. And so San Joaquin sort of piloted that approach. They came up with these reclamation district specific flood safety plans with their partners. And by 2012, DWR recognized the benefit of this approach and endorsed it. And since then, they've invested $30 million into further improving and bolstering the flood emergency preparedness realm. That work has covered a lot of ground, but it can be summarized in three things. So the first one is those flood safety plans, training and exercises, so that we can test those plans and improve those plans, and then equipping the responders with the flood fight supplies that they need. And then I will go into a little bit more detail about what the flood safety plans contain. And the flood safety plans are also governed by California Water Code 9650 and AB 156, which outlines exactly what San Joaquin County had already caught on, which is we need to document what we do. We need to work with our emergency response partners. And we need to learn something called ICS, SIMS, and NIMS, a little bit of alphabet soup, and I'll go into what that means. Next slide, please. So to add more detail to what's been developed, and also touch on how this aligns with the strategies outlined in the Delta Adapts Plan. I'll start on the upper left with the flood safety plans, as I mentioned. This plan outlines the administrative actions, spending authorities, and trigger conditions that prompt different actions. This is super important for long-term sustainability of our plans. As people move on or retire, we want to make sure that people continue to know what they need to do. So this is the way to help the future out and safeguard all of the experience and knowledge that we've gained over time. On the bottom, we have GIS-based map tools. So one of the important components of the flood safety plan is what we call a flood contingency map. So while the written plan covers the administrative actions and the triggers and some of the things we need to do to be in good standing to pursue recovery funding, The map outlines the field flood fight strategy. And this is a big deal that it's in a map. Historically, these flood fight strategies or operational plans were written documents. And you can imagine how hard it would be to pick up a binder that says, go to levee station 21 plus 50 and do this. And if you're a volunteer or you're helping out or you're new, that can be tough. So the map really helps responders digest information quickly and in timeliness. You can see historical critical information. And very importantly, it helps convey to your partners what you're doing and where. So the districts know their systems very well, but we have to convey this to our county. We have to convey this to the state, DWR, our federal partners, the Corps and FEMA, and keep them updated. The maps themselves have undergone several improvements since they've been developed. They started with AutoCAD and have moved into GIS, so Geographic Information Systems. We began with ArcMap and recently transitioned into ArcPro. And we've been able to leverage ArcGIS Online, all of the field and mobile apps. And in the most recent event in 2023, having a much more real-time bird's eye view of what's going on in the field in our offices really lets us respond and plan and monitor a lot better. So this has been a tremendous amount of success. The way that these maps were developed are also standardized across the Delta and the region, so that when we're working with state and federal partners, they're looking at the same thing anywhere they go, which again, that really, really helps in an event. On the upper left, we have unified commands. This ties everything together. So the flood safety plans are really focused on the reclamation district actions, right? We want them to be able to do what they need to do with the levee, and we want them to be able to work with emergency response partners. But how do we integrate and how do we work with federal partners during the event? That's where the unified command comes in. This is where we really implement this alphabet soup that I'd introduced earlier, ICS, SIMS, and NIMS. And these are systems, these are ways that agencies organize themselves to address an emergency so they can work within their organizations and with others. This was born out of several disasters throughout the nation, namely 9/11. So when 9/11 occurred, the first responder that went on site was the local fire district. But of course, that involved FBI and a bunch of other agencies. And so together they said, we need a system so that different agencies from different levels can work together effectively and we can communicate effectively. So here in California, they modeled it after California, but the reclamation districts have taken those same systems and used them to be able to work with, again, their partners and all of our state and federal partners. We've implemented and used unified commands in 2004, 2006, 2017, and recently in 2023. So the big takeaway from this is what used to take days or weeks to happen now can happen very quickly because we have all the right people in the room and we know how to work with each other. We have a framework. Finally, we developed innovative training and exercises. So to be able to build redundancy and resiliency in our response staff, we established something called the Just-in-Time Training Program. So these are free on-demand flood fight videos so that when we have volunteers or different folks that want to help out, they can. As of last year, the videos have also been produced in Spanish, and altogether we're able to use our tools. Next slide, please. Here are some pictures of how we've been exercising and training and improving our flood safety plans and tools. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the right, we have the emergency preparedness cycle. And as we look into the future, we have to continue employing this cycle, just like we've been doing, planning, organizing, training, exercising or using them, evaluating and improving it, on and on. One of the benefits of ICS, SIMS, and NIMS is that it's scalable and flexible. So that allows us to handle everything from what we have been seeing, something small like a boil, to something maybe we haven't seen like a hurricane. And now that we've gone through this training and using it since 1997, taking it into a future becomes a real possibility and seeing how we need to change and adapt. So we've done the legwork. So off of that strong foundation, what we still need to work on are things that sort of are beyond the levee maintainers. It's mass evacuation, shelter in place, and public alert and warning. But that still requires us to have a role. It requires us to work with our County of Emergency Services, sheriff departments, and the state. Unique challenges of the Delta, of course, are limited ingress and egress, so one way in, maybe one way out, where mass evacuation may just not be a possibility, maybe shelter in place. And that's where I see where the priorities need to be in the future. Thank you. Question?
I'll just briefly reiterate, council members, I'd like to open that up to your thoughts first.
I appreciate the presentation so far because we do need to invest in our levees and make sure everything's, stable, and the emergency preparedness, personal responsibility, local, state, federal investing. With the Oakland Hills fire, we had challenges similar to what you're talking about with 9/11. And so in the Bay Area, we work very hard to make sure all our systems are working together. And I think people often forget that when something happens, it's not just that agency that's doing the responding. It's outside agencies that aren't familiar with maybe the geography or anything. And so it is important. And this is a plan that doesn't just get put on a shelf, but is constantly revisited and redone because things do change. You talked about egress and regress. It is challenging on that, but it's also challenging as far as electricity. Mm-hmm. So sometimes people don't have power, which does not give them access to communication or being able to shelter in place properly. And the other part of the challenges in the Delta is access to the internet. Since we've gone away from landlines, we are more and more dependent on cell phones. And so when we're talking about shelter in place or even, alerts, that there's a weakness there. So I just wanted to add those things to that.
Oh.
Go ahead, Vinny.
Thank you. Liz, thank you so much for the presentation. And Councilmember Burgess brought up some really important points that I was reminded of. And we hear more and more that people are going from cell phone use or going away from landline to more and more cell phone use. With the notion of equity, I'm going to talk about people that still are very much attached to their landline. Some for, just age or, their comfort level. I'll put my mom into that equation. You give her a cell phone and you think you're giving her a bomb because she says, oh, no, I don't know how to operate that. It's her comfort level. And so I think, again, given the context of what we're talking about is being able to provide timely information for any and all individuals in the Delta, for them to be able to prepare. One issue that I think came out of the floods of '97 were water contamination issues. And a lot of people who are strictly dependent on septic tanks and, how do you inform, again, the entire community, but again, those communities that are what I would consider marginalized and again, don't have that ability to be able to take a look at things on social media, mass media. How are we going to integrate them into the system to, again, ensure that we are reaching the masses? Councilmember Lee brought up a a really important point, I think a few council meetings ago, with regard to how the Office of Emergency Services operates with the governor's office. And the idea for me was, how are we looking long-term for a command post or an operations center specifically for the Delta to identify, again, unique Delta attributes, unique Delta needs, unique Delta communities, and how is that going to interface, again, with the Office of Emergency Services in Sacramento? And I still think that I would like to take up the offer that Councilmember Lee thought or suggested, that maybe we take a tour, again, to see how we can take a look at, again, long-term planning. These are very, very dire scenarios that we're hearing of today. Dire enough for, again, for us to reflect on how important these adaptation strategies and plan are going to move us in the next, in the next dimension, if you will.
Thanks, Virginia, for that. Yeah, I was just going to mention how much I appreciate this section of the strategy, because even though our levees right now may be up to a 100-year flood level, and we'd like to see them go further than that, it only takes one of these events to wipe out a community and a whole area. And those have generation-lasting effects on communities. And a lot of the disadvantaged people in areas that we've seen where these type of emergencies have happened are forced to leave because they can't afford to rebuild, or the insurance doesn't cover it, or they're scared because you lose faith, that things are going to get taken care of for them. But on the less dire side of things, I will say that in California, we have a very robust Office of Emergency Services and a mutual aid network that is unsurpassed in the country. We have other countries, Australia, for example, and other places that send us firefighters, and we do the same for them. But I think it's even more important that the mapping and the things that you had talked about are in place here locally, because if there is a disaster, it's not just the people in the Delta that are going to respond, it's anybody and everybody from all over the country. And some state employees don't know this, but anyone who's a state employee can be deputized in an emergency and sent into the area to do a job completely different from anything on their duty statement. And I've actually seen that happen, especially during the pandemic. So we never know when we're going to be called upon, and it's really important to have all of these strategies and plans in place locally, because we do have such a robust system that's been working for decades. I think we can all take comfort in that, but we also know that the planning locally is really super important to that whole network working. So thank you for your information today.
Yeah, and I think wearing my hat as an engineer, we're realizing how important it is. I mean, we've realized how important it is to work with our Office of Emergency Services, but also how important it is to stay in our lane with public messaging. You don't want an engineer to send out public messaging, but we do need to educate our partners in what level of threat we are, what the level of urgency is, so that when we are there, then the reaction is right. And so I think we are in a great place to certainly embrace our role in educating that and letting OES and their public information officers say, okay, here's what we need to do to improve our information sharing.
I have one. I was looking at your pie chart and how you separated the four things, and I'm trying to visualize in real life how that works. Is it like the areas that could, let's say the communities that are endangered and at risk? So these tools are used to do some kind of a regular training, regular reaching out, number one. And number two, do we kind of stratify them by the level of risk? And because our resources might be limited, who gets to know what first and how? Because at some point we're going to be responsible for also identifying the hottest spot. And do you think that we're doing that, we're there for what is needed to be done? I mean, in real world, when we try to implement this pie chart?
For sure. Okay, so the first question and how these are used. So they have definitely been used in the recent events since 97, 2004, 2006, 2017, 2019, 2023. But in between every 2 hours, the plans are revisited. There's an exercise, we reevaluate and we test it. When we have new staff, we retrain, we reevaluate. Right now, because it's largely driven by grant funding, so the counties are able to update and work on all of their districts at once. And I don't know that they've been prioritized in any way other than just as funding becomes available. Where we are today, every reclamation district, or all 5 counties have received a grant and they have a flood safety plan. The flood safety plan and the map, the 2 left quadrants, those are used fairly regularly by the reclamation districts. The unified commands, that's when we kind of move up to a county level, tend to be pulled out during an exercise or an event. And then the training, again, every 2 years we do it. So the most recent exercise was in August of 2022. We had 5 tabletop exercises with each of the Delta counties and then a full-scale real life exercise. And it was great because just a few months later, we had a real life high water event. So very dynamic.
So you would say that what % of what we're doing is preventive versus after the fact?
Yes, yeah, and I didn't touch on it too much, but also helps a lot with recovery. So if we're looking, to look for FEMA, public assistance, or DWR, kind of this pre-planning helps us get our ducks in a row too.
And you would say like preventive wise, is there enough? I mean, I know that we have the tools, but are the tools used before or after? And what % will be before in your mind of all the work that has been done to make sure that we know, everybody knows how to prevent or minimize the impact
Of these existing tools, I think all of them, we keep using them and updating. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for that discussion. Council members, any other comments at this time? Okay. For those of you just joining us, we are providing a 3-minute timer for each comment just to help you gauge your own pace. If your comments exceed the timer, you may be asked to continue the discussion offline, and council staff is available for discussion after the meeting. So I'd like to now turn to our in-person audience for any comments that you would like to contribute. Carly will come around with the microphone.
Good afternoon or good morning, council and members. I want to first of all congratulate my colleague for a wonderful presentation. I'm Chris Newdeck with KSN, and this is an exercise that we've been endeavoring in since '97 effectively, and we're very, very proud of it. But I wanted to highlight something that I don't think is really focused on because it's not really a local driven effort, and that's on the priority focus areas. And the first and foremost is the mass evacuations. I want all of you to think back to 2017 and the Oroville effort of trying to evacuate Oroville. Our presenter today, Liz, was one of the few, not one of the many unfortunate ones that was stuck on the highway with her husband and father-in-law for several hours waiting for that wave of water to crash over and basically decimate her. Mass evacuations in California are not effective. We do not have the transportation system to get the people out of this valley, particularly in the Delta region. Both Interstate 5 and 99 will be flooded in a major flood event, so we can't go north. You all been aware of that. We had some even in 2023, but clearly in 97, both those transport areas were cut off. And trying to move to the Bay Area is no better place. So we really need to encourage the state and our public safety participants to really look at that. What are we going to do with these people? You're going to throw them all on the highway? They're not going to go anywhere. They're not even going to get on the highway. One of the things, one of our local local planning entities, which happens to be the city of Lathrop, areas in the floodplain, they're now mandating two-story homes for shelter in place. Now, you're not going to have a kitchen on the second floor, but you're going to be able to, survive. And many others are putting axes and chainsaws in their attics because they have to get up in their attic and cut themselves out of those roofs. So this is something that's really a problem in California. Our highways are so clogged because we're all, surface transportation. We can't get the people out of these areas. And it's something I want this council to think about as this mass evacuation issue. It's something that's very substantial. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, Dominic Gooley again. I submitted written comments relative to adapting for flood control. And I bring your attention to my 11 by 17 sheet there, number 25. That shows a plan up around New Hogan, Don Pedro Dam and New Maloney's to be able to store extra flood water. Like as in today, we could be diverting water and emptying the reservoir to prepare for all the snow. But I also bring your attention to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, page 3 in your packet there. If you look at the Tuolumne River and Don Pedro Reservoir, right now, they only have 340,000 acre feet of storage available for flood control. And right now, the existing conditions, it requires 513. So we're short, and that's why we have problems. And we will have problems if it rains in a couple of weeks. If the snow were to develop to anything, we'd have problems with them discharging too much water. They can only discharge 10,000 CFS down through the Tuolumne River towards Modesto because that's all the channel can handle. So we have a problem there. So this diagram shows a plan to store the water. And I think the council needs to look heavily at flood managed aquifer recharge in combination with bigger reservoirs, because that's the solution. And when you get to your other item about climate, water resiliency, if you store the water, then you can use it in times of drought to supplement water supply. Luke Bryan has a song. I always tell people that rain is a good thing. Rain makes corn, and corn makes whiskey, and whiskey makes my baby just a little bit frisky. So climate change is an opportunity for California, okay? If we're going to get more rain, so long as we have some place to put it, it's a good thing. Now, there's quite a bit in your package there. It's a lot of thought. I didn't just prepare it today, but you can see the discharge curves there on page 11 by 17. I did the 3 big flood years, 97, 2017, and last year. And if you take the area under the curve, you can see in those flood events, we had over 1 million acre feet of water discharged out into the San Francisco Bay, and we should be catching that water. So in order to adapt for flood control in the Delta, it's better to solve the problem for the whole area, including Modesto and Stockton and all the highways and whatnot. If we can catch all that water, let it seep into the ground, use it to make electricity. There's a picture in there of a combo hydroelectric plant, because if you make electricity during the daytime when it's expensive, and then at nighttime pump it back up to make it the next day, it's very economical way and a very good way of adapting to climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic.
Good morning, Council. Gilbert Cosio, River Delta Consulting. I just want to make a comment on the graph that Liz showed, showing that the Delta Levy Subventions Program after 1988, when it got significant funding increase, really flattened that curve out as far as levy breaches per year. I also want to mention and remind the Council that not only did we improve the levees, we were required to maintain the habitat that was out there. And then in 1996, when AB 360 passed, we were required to enhance the habitat that was out there. So not only do we get levee improvements, we actually have maintained the habitat in a multi-benefit programmatic level, not just island by island or project by project. So that's one of the things we would really push in the future is, can we do things programmatically? Because every project cannot implement multi-benefits on its own, but certainly programmatically we can do it, and we have done it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, council members. Russ Ryan, I'm a trustee on 4 reclamation districts. One thing I wanted to point and emphasize about preparedness. I'm a civil engineer licensed by trade, and when I came working into the Delta, I noticed, whoa, this is incredible with these levees and the subsidence issues. So our Bolden, we have been last couple of years looking at a pilot project that looks at instrumentation, whether it's traditional or advanced technologies or innovative type technologies that puts instrumentation in the levee and monitors it so that we could respond in advance if the levee moves. We actually had that situation occurred in January 2023 where we saw through an instrumentation that the west levee on Bolden moved a little bit. So then that caused us to implore these engineers to meet KSN, MBK, all the engineering firms, as well as the geotechs, Quorum and Tillis came out and we all met about it, and that promoted us to talk to DWR to do a directed action program emergency situation where we brought in some fill. So then fast forward to October 18th when we had the earthquake over by Twitchell Island, we noticed that there wasn't any further movement. This is just an example that highlights that if we're in front of it and, you know, doing things to predict or be prepared versus responding, that's a much better way. And it's also very much cheaper than that. So the pilot project that I referred to, we're actually wrapping it up in a report and should have that available in the next month or two. And we're going to take that report and talk to DWR and others and, you know, have a conversation on how that could be better influenced and incorporated into some of these emergency operation plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ.
Erin McDowell. I'm with the Sacramento County Farm Bureau. I worked with the Sacramento County developing the agriculture pass, which is to get people into evacuation areas after disaster zones, mainly for livestock, but other, you know, security issues. What we had noticed in that is that, and this is dealing more with public notification, is that when we lose power, especially with cell towers, our cell phones will not work. And so out in this area, that happened last year, you know, I live right here on Grand Island. We were out for 5 days. We had no cellular reception. It was very hard to get updates or notification or find out what's going on around with our neighbors and stuff. So what was kind of addressed in OCS's for Sacramento County was having these evacuation maps. And they're like, just go online and pull them down. That's too late. We need to really make sure we're addressing that there are printed materials ahead of time for residents. They know where their resources are ahead of time so that when these events do happen, that we can try to figure out other ways to communicate, maybe having radios or other things. But we need to kind of educate the people nowadays that cell phones are not going to be reliable during emergency evacuations and things like that. So, and a lot of these people are going to shelter in place. Especially with last year, we had a lot of trees down, the roads were blocked. So we are trapped in this area. And so we do need to figure out solutions for notifications, whether it's the fire station sirens, and other ways to reach out to people.
Thank you, Erin.
Good morning, Melinda Terry with the Central Valley Flood Control Association and also North Delta Water Agency. So welcome to our part of the Delta. Whenever there's Delta planning efforts and meetings, there's always a lot of talk about flows in terms of water supply and habitat. But when it comes to flood protection, I want you to think about flood flows. And it's already been brought up by John and Dominic. It's about capacity of these channels. Like if they were designed, particularly 1/3 of the levees were project levees, they had a design level, but if these channels are no longer functioning in order to efficiently and quickly evacuate floodwaters, you know, that's a danger as well. So when you think of flows, please also think of flood flows and about what John brought up and Dominic and the things that need to be addressed to keep these channels with a capacity that will work in high water events. The other thing is Kathy Schaefer spoke. You may not realize her expertise on FEMA, but I do encourage you to rely on her. But you may also want to check each county is responsible. There's certain things they have to implement for NFIP. And so you may want to hear from them and understand some of these requirements that they do. And then I would also recommend you think about each of you. I did it my first year when I started this job, is I went and did, DWR has an annual flood fighting training. Basically you learn how to put Visqueen on and fill up sandbags. It's back breaking, so be prepared. But, you know, it gives you a feel for, you know, having an understanding. Also gives you an appreciation for the California Conservation Corps, because they are pre-trained people that even local districts, you know, can call on, and they're just so good at what they do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it now to Emma. Do we have anyone online that would like to contribute to the conversation?
We do. First, we have Artie Valencia.
I'm so sorry. Can I pause? I didn't realize there was one more in the room.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Charlie, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Brett Baker, and I represent the Central Delta Water Agency. I apologize. These comments are going to be a little bit out of order. I thought we were going to be done by noon, so I made some prior arrangements. But anyhow, I just want to get these things out to you before I left. But yeah, I just want to read this quote from Charles Darwin to you. It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And just from my personal experience, growing up on a farm here in the North Delta and in agriculture, you can best do that by keeping your options open. So I have not seen the draft strategy yet. I'm looking forward to that. But I wanted to just encourage you and impart on you some thoughts about how we can maybe look at some more creative ideas and thoughts and solutions as we face a changing climate. So I think we could, you know, look at the existing facilities and assets that we have. I think my colleague Dan Jr. is going to talk to you about this a little bit later, but we'd like you to look at recirculating water out of San Luis Reservoir and how that might help water quality standards in the Delta, or provide more additional operational flexibility. Also want to say that, you know, when we look at a water quality or supply standpoint, I think we need to take a real hard look at what it would take to operate our state and federal projects under a drought of record, what a firm yield might be in comparison to like a 29 through 34 drought. I think Mr. Herrick brought up dredging earlier. We need to take a serious look at adding that tool back into our toolbox. It's a strategy that's worked for centuries here. I think we could also look at things like putting in sills and gates to help with salinity intrusion in times of low flow. I think that we do that in the Mississippi River. The Army Corps builds a sill to prevent salinity intrusion. These things may be, you know, within the legal delta. They may be a little bit outside of the legal delta. Maybe we need to look both upstream and downstream. And so we can't put ourselves in a box, keep our options open. I'll just end on this. We're going to begin discussing change in point of diversion for the isolated facility, water fix, or whatever you want to call it these days. So I just want to reiterate here, this is our strategy within the Delta, is to fight to have that facility built. If it ever does get built, we're going to fight to operate it. And then lastly, we're going to fight to tear it down. So there's a huge interim period that needs to be focused on, and we can't throw the existing infrastructure in the Delta under the bus without considering the long-term effects and the interim effects on how we get to where we want to go from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. Okay, let's move to our commenters on Zoom.
All right, first we have Artie Valencia. You should be able to speak.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Artie Valencia with Restore the Delta. First, I want to thank the board for the opportunity to provide feedback on the Delta Adapts initiative. I commend the effort to address climate resilience in the Delta. However, I want to highlight a couple key points for consideration. So funding equity under FL 2-4, while securing state and federal funding is crucial for levy upgrades, the 10% local cost share requirement can disproportionately weigh on disadvantaged communities. It's imperative for government agencies to collaborate with community philanthropy groups or other resources to alleviate this. Without meeting this cost share, these communities can face higher insurance rates and can risk complete loss of property assets in flood events. Next, the importance of levy subvention programs. FL 2-8. Levy subvention programs play a critical role in supporting long-term projects in the rural Delta areas. Even so, these funds are currently at risk of being cut by the legislature. Next, enhanced emergency response plans, FL 4-1. The analysis of existing response plans should address geographical constraints, and efforts to enhance rapid communication and disseminate information in areas prone to power loss are crucial. There must be an outlined strategy to address these common problems, particularly in rural Delta communities. Next, we're really happy to see that a lot of best practices were incorporated into the flood response in the report, but it still falls short in a couple places. So in the community involvement in emergency planning, FL 4-4, incorporating nonprofits and community leaders into emergency response planning is essential for understanding the unique challenges of each Delta community. Next, alternative communication methods, FL 6-1. While local broadcasts can assist in disseminating information, alternative methods should be considered in scenarios involving power loss and infrastructure damage. Providing affordable cranking radios and collaborating with local radio stations can ensure access to vital information during these emergencies. And last, under FL-9, there's no specification whether exports or ecosystem recovery is being optimized. Is it to provide habitat conditions necessary to support native fish species during critical times? For instance, when reservoirs like sites capture more water upstream, less of it makes it down to allow the estuary to recover. So there must be a balance between water capture levels and methods to ensure that they align with ecosystem needs. Otherwise, increased water capture can negatively impact critical migrating periods for spawning salmon that depend on adequate flow release. Thank you so much. In conclusion, I just feel like these points can strengthen your resilience plan. And I want to again thank you for your commitment to creating a climate resilient future.
Thank you, Artie. That was a lot very quickly, and I appreciate it. Emma, do we have anyone else online who'd like to contribute?
We do. Yes, we have Deirdre Desjardins. You should be able to speak.
Thank you. I did want to address, I'm very concerned given extreme flooding around the world in 2022 and 2023 that we could see extreme flooding in the Delta watershed sooner rather than later. Daniel Swain has estimated that there's a 50-50 chance of seeing a flood at least as large as the Great Flood of 1862 over the next 40 years. And it would inundate most Delta islands. And the problem is the U.S. Geological Survey constructed an emergency response scenario, the arc storm scenario. But unlike their earthquake scenario, the arc storm scenario was rejected by local flood planners as too extreme, even though it was based on historic flood, the Great Flood of 1862. And our understanding is the probability of seeing such a flood is just increasing with climate change. And the evacuation, it's not being considered in county emergency plans in the Central Valley and the Delta and its watersheds. And we're already seeing evacuation issues with the kind of high water that we've seen historically. And that's just the beginning. We could see a step increase in extreme precipitation. We may already be seeing it in California. It's all over the world, but it hasn't hit the Western US yet or Siberia. So the other issue is the Delta levy investment strategy didn't consider evacuation needs. They just rated one if there was a road, and they didn't consider that these are major evacuation routes for people in the Delta. And you really need to look at Highway 160 and the Delta levy investment strategy north and south of Clarksburg. It doesn't find state interest in maintaining those levees, even though Highway 160 is on there and it's a critical evacuation route for people. So I would really encourage not just considering a 1 in 200 year flood with the old the 10-year-old climate models. That's what was used for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. But also newer research, newer climate models are showing increased extreme precipitation and these
I think we've gone beyond
emergency
time.
scenarios. Thank you. So.
Thank you. Okay, we're running a little behind, so we're going to move on to the next panel, but there will be a general public comment for this agenda item as a whole at the end, if you didn't get to comment during this section. I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
Okay, hello again. If we can go to the next slide, please. And one more slide. And one more. Okay, thank you. Next, we're going to talk about our ecosystem strategies. This slide lists our 4 ecosystem strategies and some examples of supporting actions. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go through all the details, but we can talk more in the discussion section after this. The strategies are broadly aligned with and build on existing policies and recommendations in the Delta Plan. The ecosystem strategies aim to strengthen the ability of the Delta ecosystem to adapt, beginning with restoring and conducting habitats to meet Delta Plan goals, protecting functional flows, and halting and reversing land subsidence. The strategies also align with 5 core strategies that are listed in our June 2022 amendment to Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan, which is on ecosystem restoration. In addition, beyond the immediate benefits to the ecosystem, the strategies have co-benefits. For example, reduced flood risk, improved water quality and storage and attenuation of floodwaters, improved access to green space, especially for communities that lack access, and that's an equity issue here in the Delta. Tribal access to cultural resources such as stewardship, restoration, and revitalization. I also wanted to note that subsidence halting obviously has many co-benefits. This is an area we're highlighting under ecosystem, but it's also relevant to agriculture, flood risk reduction, and our other strategy. To go through just a few examples here, our first ecosystem strategy is to improve the capacity of ecosystems and native species to adapt to and thrive under future conditions. This has many actions under it, but to highlight one, it focuses on the need to build broader partnerships, including with working with and learning from tribes. CNRA, the California Natural Resources Agency, is proposed as a lead on this, given their existing roles and is home to many relevant agencies at the state. Our second strategy, Eco2, is to protect at-risk ecosystems by halting and reversing subsidence and reducing the risk of levee failures. Again, this is a critical issue in the Delta, and we're going to hear more about this in a moment. Subsidence is a major risk not only to ecosystems, but all the thematic areas. Flood risk reduction is one where this often comes up about differential pressure on levees for these really, really deeply subsided islands.
In action under this, Eco 2-1 aims to incentivize land use types that halt or reverse subsidence. This could be done in different ways, so it isn't just restoration. Again, it could be different agricultural practices, managed flooding that for some crops that allow that, rice, and other actions such as that. The lead on this is the Delta Conservancy, and we're fortunate to have the Conservancy here today to speak about this important issue. Our third strategy is to build the capacity and coordination to improve ecosystem function and resilience with an equity lens. The California Natural Resources Agency is again proposed as a lead on this. An example action under this is to prepare program-level environmental documentation, as well as prepare with and fund opportunities for tribes to identify and implement shared nature-based solutions. And our last strategy under ecosystem is to protect and enhance urban ecosystems and use nature-based solutions to increase climate resilience of urban areas in and near the Delta. CNRA and the Strategic Growth Council are suggested leads on this. An example of this is increasing canopy cover in urban areas and increasing green space near or adjacent to urban areas. Okay, and go to the next slide, please. All right, so again, we're fortunate to have the Conservancy here. I'm going to hand it over to Campbell Ingram in a moment. Campbell is from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. He's been an executive officer of the Conservancy for several years, and he's going to speak about his work on subsidence halting and reversal in the Delta. Over to you, Campbell.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, Chair and council members and everyone. It's good to be here. I always enjoy talking about subsidence in the Delta and opportunities to address subsidence. Next slide, please. One more. Next slide, please. So just for those of you that aren't really familiar with the Delta Conservancy, we are a state agency. We were created as part of the Delta Reform Act. Our role is to do ecosystem restoration, but also do economic development in the Delta. We have put about 140 projects out on the landscape, and you can see our mission statement there. Essentially, we're intended to work with the community, develop projects that are locally supported, and then implement projects. You think of us as really a funding entity. Next slide. So getting right into subsidence, I like this map a lot. I think it starts to tell a story of two very different deltas. From the yellow to the orange to the red, you really have increasing levels of organic carbon in the peat soils. So at the edge of the yellow, you have really tidal elevations. And then, of course, you get down into the deeply subsided areas in the Delta. I also like this map a lot because it's old. This is the 1995 map from the Cal Fed Bay Delta program. And you can see there it says the red is in excess of 15 feet deep. So that's 30 years ago. And so we are about 4 feet deeper than that. And I think we know now that we have areas in the Delta that are 20 to 25 feet deep. So you can imagine 4 feet deep in the last 30 years, another 15 years, we'll go another 2 feet deep. It's an ongoing problem. We see subsidence rates of 0.5 to 1.5 inches per year. Obviously, we know sea level is rising. And then tying this back to, I appreciate this being in the ecosystem section, but I also think it really is important to recognize the ever-growing threat that this poses to everything in the Delta. Obviously, it threatens all the agriculture in that zone, the communities themselves, and then the recognized threat to the water supply if we were to lose the Western Delta. Next slide, please. The process by which subsidence happens, I think we're all fairly familiar, but that first chart there you see pre-1880, when these were wetlands created through eons of sea level rise, created 100+ feet depths of peat soil. When we started to do agriculture on those lands, you had to cut those drains and be able to drain the water out of the root zone to be able to grow crops. That exposes that root zone and that soil column to oxygen. Microbes get in there and they digest that carbon, and it volatilizes directly into the atmosphere. There's some settling, there's been some burning of peat in the past, but really the majority of that carbon has been volatilized into the atmosphere. So when we see those islands out there, the islands in the red and the orange, 20 to 30 feet below sea level, that's carbon that has volatilized into the atmosphere, continues to do so. I like that picture there because it just shows a ship going up the San Joaquin River at the south end of Twitchell Island. And you can see that the draft of that ship is well below the surface level of the ground there in the foreground. Next slide. One more picture, pictures simply don't do it justice, but this is the south end of Staten Island. And you can see the river there perched about 20 feet above Staten Island. Staten Island's about 9,200 acres. And again, there's about 150 to 200,000 acres in this condition. Next slide. I also think it's really important to try to quantify the carbon that is being put into the atmosphere from the Delta. We're seeing an average of 10 metric tons of carbon per acre per year. So if you were to scrape 1 inch of soil off an acre of land and weigh it, it would be roughly 10 tons. We're seeing numbers as high as 25 tons per acre. And of course, as you get close to that yellow range that we showed earlier, it's closer to 3 tons per acre. So in that area of about 150,000 acres in the Delta, you're getting 1.2 million metric tons of carbon per year pumped into the atmosphere. That's the equivalent of about 300,000 vehicles. It's also about 25% of California's total plant-based agricultural emissions. So you have about 17 million arable acres of plant-based agriculture in California that produces about 8 million tons of carbon, about 1.2 million tons out of the Delta. I often like to describe it as a little chimney in the center of the state that really is just pumping carbon into the atmosphere at a pretty astounding rate. Next slide. So fortunately, we have readily available solutions, and it is to simply re-wet that land. Re-wetting peat soils stops the subsidence, stops CO2 emissions. If we do that with rice cultivation, we have a viable agricultural commodity that can stop subsidence, stop the carbon emissions for the most part, still have drying in the shoulder months when you have to prep fields and then harvest fields. And if we use managed wetlands, then you can actually start to accrete soils at a couple centimeters per year as well. So we know that we have a lot of land in the Delta that has become, already, that's good. We have a lot of land in the Delta that is becoming too wet to farm because we're kind of going through that peat layer. So those areas that are already too wet to farm, it's a really good opportunity to be able to create managed wetland or do rice cultivation. DWR has implemented about 3,000 acres between Sherman and Twitchell Islands of managed wetland. And then we actually received a $36 million allotment 2 years ago for nature-based solutions. And we were able to fund 4 projects that will realize about 11,000 acres of conversion, so avoid about 110,000 tons of carbon emissions per year. The 2 big projects there are working with the Metropolitan Water District Partnership to restore all of Webb Tract. This is going to take a whole island and turn it into a mosaic of managed wetland and rice cultivation. And stop the subsidence, stop the carbon emissions, but really demonstrate how we can manage a whole island in a way that should be economically viable, give us sufficient resources to maintain the levees, but also stop subsidence, stop it going the wrong direction, as well as stop the overwhelming carbon emissions. The other big project that we're funding is working with the Nature Conservancy, and in that program, they're going to be working to incentivize Delta farmers to convert to rice cultivation, helping them offset the cost of conversion by providing funding to help do land leveling and do water management infrastructure. Hoping again that results in about 5,000 acres of restored or conversion to rice. There's also 2 smaller projects that will result in about 1,100 acres. Next slide, please. Couple words about the carbon market quickly. There is a voluntary carbon market protocol approved by the American Carbon Registry. It's called the California Restoration of California Deltaic Coastal Wetlands. That allows a landowner to actually quantify their baseline emissions, quantify what their project will do to reduce those emissions, process whereby then you can validate and certify those credits for the third party, and you can take those credits to the market and you can get funding. You can sell those credits for revenue. Right now, those revenues are fairly low, but we anticipate that the market is, in the years that I've been working on this since 2015, the market has gone from about $7 per credit or ton to about $15 to $20 per credit or ton. So you see a growing market that at some point will hit a inflection point where it will provide significantly, hopefully more revenue than a lot of the commodities that are grown in subsided areas of the Delta. And we do have a request to the Air Resources Board to adopt that voluntary market protocol with the cap and trade program, which would significantly increase the value of that carbon credits. Next slide. I guess I wanted to mention two more quick things. First, unfortunately, that $36 million is spent, and we are essentially without funding. We are actively seeking funding through the federal programs for the Inflation Reduction Act, and then we're also hopeful that there is a climate bond on the ballot in November that would keep funding available to keep this work moving forward. And also want to mention that we have established sort of an unofficial target of trying to re-wet about 50,000 acres by 2045. So with that last tranche of money, I think we're close to 11,000 acres that will be coming online. But we really want to try to achieve at least another 40,000 acres between now and 20. So thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. Council members, I'd like to open it up now for your thoughts. Go ahead, Virginia.
Campbell, thank you so much for your presentation. You know, every time I hear you and those numbers just fly, I know you're looking at a slide, but they just fly. I mean, you know the subject matter so well, and I'm so impressed with what you're doing, what the Delta Conservancy continues to do and is striving for. Just a couple of questions. With regard to, did you say it was 150,000 to 200,000 acres that are in subsidence?
Absolutely. If you can go back to your chart, that map shown, the kind of that orange and red area within the map in the Central Delta represents about 150 to 200,000 acres that is deeply subsided. So it really is a big bowl, right, kind of in the center of the Delta.
So the question for me is, how much of that are we going to be able to work with private landowners? I know that there is that incentive to get them to grow rice, to re-wet some of that soil, but what is really feasible at this point?
Right. So as I mentioned, we've put a target out there of about 50,000 acres, and that's sort of based on what we understand about what land is in public ownership or publicly funded ownership between Metropolitan Water District, DWR, the Nature Conservancy, a few others, and then working with private landowners. So I think the readily available opportunity is the more public entities or those that have been publicly funded, but we are focusing quite a bit on rice with private landowners, as well as landowners that recognize that they've got land that they can't farm anymore. So if they can turn that into managed wetland, get a revenue stream from that, that's a potential benefit to them. So I think the opportunity really sits with public lands, but I also think that people in the Delta are really starting to recognize that converting to rice, addressing other issues to make themselves more sustainable, address their subsidence problem is actually happening. Evidence of that, I think, really is the interest that we had money actually fund projects.
Thank you so much.
Councilmember Lee?
Hi, thank you. I have a question. Yesterday, we had a great conversation about the carbon market, and Member Hueso gave us a terrific primer that helped clarify, I think, for a lot of us how that all worked. Very interested in your request to the Air Resources Board. Do you have a timeline for when they're going to address that?
No, we don't, fortunately. I think I would just be speculating, but there's been a lot of pressure put on them to adopt additional protocols. There was a legislative process that had to put together a panel. This protocol was actually recognized from that panel as one that they should actually consider for adoption. But that's happened several years ago, and I don't really.
Any other thoughts or comments from our council? Okay, excellent. Let's move to comments from the room. Carly, we'll come around to you if you just want to raise your hand if you'd like to make a public comment on this panel. Okay, hearing none. Emma, do we have anyone online that would like to contribute to the conversation?
We do. We have a comment from Deirdre Desjardins. You should be able to speak now.
Thank you. I do really appreciate the work of the council on this, but I did want to point out that we're not only seeing wetter wet years, we're seeing drier dry years with the 21st century climate, and fish are going to go extinct if we don't do a better job of meeting the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan standards. And I don't really understand why ecosystem actions don't include developing a plan to meet the water quality control plan standards. There is a possibility of doing reservoir management, which targets reliability for Delta ecosystem flows rather than reliability for south of Delta exports. And that just hasn't been studied. Thank you.
Thanks, Deidre. We have another comment from David Bradshaw. You should be able to speak.
Okay, thank you. Question for Campbell. Did you say about the rice conversion? David Bradshaw, Metropolitan Water District. I'm just curious about the rotation that'll be involved. So the way I understand it, you can't grow rice, year after year. There may be a break after so many years. And has there been any other discussion on other crops you could put in for that in between years, or has that topic come up much? Or if there's another crop we don't know about that would add to accretion rather than more subsidence.
Yeah, so essentially you're looking for any crop that maintains inundated land, right? Because it's having the water on the land that stops the subsidence, stops the carbon emission. We are aware that some farms in and around the Delta grow rice consistently, but we also know that it's general practice. Farmers want to rotate, and there's benefit to rotating. So we're looking at ways that you could do rotation fallowing or other crops that essentially would allow you to grow rice for the majority of time, get the climate benefit, but then not essentially erase that benefit that you've achieved through whatever rotation that you're doing. So I think there are opportunities. The crux of it, though, is you really have to do that quantification to know what your ultimate climate benefit is, so that you're certain that you're paying for a climate benefit that's not being erased during that rotation.
Thank you for that, Campbell. Any other questions or comments?
Not from online, no.
Okay, great. We're now going to take a quick 10-minute break. There are some snacks in the back of the room. Help yourself. And we'll see you back here at, we'll call it 11:50. I'll cut you a little short. Okay, welcome back. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to jump right back into it to try to stay on time. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Annie Merritt, who's going to kick off the next panel.
Great. Thanks, Beck. And hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So, okay, yeah, I see we're on the right slide. So yeah, now we'll switch over to talk about the agriculture adaptation strategies. So agriculture is and will continue to be a fundamental part of the Delta's history, culture, and economy. It's the economic engine of the region, providing jobs and a significant annual economic output, including a diverse amount of crops are grown in the Delta. However, on the left side of this slide here, you can see, as identified in the vulnerability assessment, climate change will impact agriculture. So, for example, climate change threatens Delta agriculture with more variable precipitation, saltwater intrusion, expected water quality declines, flooding, extreme heat, and reduced chill hours. And all of that could threaten crop yield and quality. So as Dan noted, with Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. As Dan noted with the previous strategies that we went over, these adaptation strategies that I'll go through build from but go beyond what's already in the Delta plan. So the Delta plan lays a foundation for agricultural adaptation through various policies and recommendations. So just as an example, several Delta plan recommendations encourage subsidence reversal. And there's a recommendation that state agencies work with and provide funding to local agencies and districts to adaptively manage agricultural lands to improve habitat conditions for native species. So now on to the draft strategies themselves. So in the middle of the slide here, it lists the 4 agricultural adaptation strategy topics, and then just some examples of supporting actions. So again, each strategy does have an identified lead for implementation, which I'll note today. And then for each strategy, we also identified a number of partner agencies and other entities to help implement the strategy as well. But in the interest of time, I won't go through all of those today. So the first strategy is to build a sustainable and equitable regional food system. And the lead for this would be the California Department of Food and Agriculture, or CDFA. So this strategy includes 5 supporting actions, such as labor and workforce development and promoting small family-owned, diversified and urban farms, and improving local and affordable food access. So I think that's a good example of an equity issue, that last one. The next strategy is to expand adoption and support implementation of climate-smart farming practices across Delta agricultural lands. And the lead for that would also be CDFA. So this strategy includes 8 supporting actions. So just a couple examples of those actions are irrigation efficiency management practices, building soil health, and implementing integrated pest management where appropriate. The next strategy is to support diversification of income and revenue opportunities on operating agricultural lands. And again, we named CDFA as the lead for this strategy. This strategy has 5 supporting actions, such as supporting agritourism and cultural opportunities, and supporting and funding environmental credits. So, for example, carbon credits, like Campbell mentioned earlier, or wildlife-friendly farming incentives. And finally, the last strategy is to cooperatively identify strategic agricultural land retirement opportunities where other land uses would be of high value, both monetary or non-monetary value. So we named the Delta Conservancy as the lead for this strategy. And this strategy has 4 supporting actions. For example, the strategic retirement of land away from agriculture for other uses, and workforce development and training opportunities for alternative economic opportunities and local industries, such as agrivoltaics, or using land for both agriculture and solar energy production, or other renewable energy sources. So next slide, please. Yeah, so now we will hear from Michael Wolf, who's the Healthy Soils Program Supervisor with CDFA. And Michael will speak about some of CDFA's climate smart agriculture programs that are especially pertinent to the Delta, and which support several of the draft adaptation strategies that I just went over. So take it away, Michael.
Thank you. Next slide, I suppose. I'm lucky to have become the supervisor of the Healthy Soils program about half a year ago. But before that, I was working for several years at CDFA as a climate change mitigation and adaptation specialist. And it was great to be included in this process and to participate in really compiling a number of the strategies and approaches that you'll see in the Delta Adapts Plan. And that involved a lot of visits, as has been mentioned before, to groups of farmers and ranchers, and workshops where we, carefully compiled different ideas that we heard. There was a lot of hard work behind what I see in the strategy. So I will speak for the next few minutes principally about what the CDFA can do through its incentive programs, but of course, as you noticed, our potential scope for advocacy and coordination in in the plan is not limited to that, but that will be my focus. Next slide, please. So an impressive list of the Healthy Soils Program practices that are supported, about 27 of them. Not going to talk about each of them individually by any means, but I did want to just lay the groundwork quickly. What is the Healthy Soils Program, Healthy Soils Incentive Program, which is most of our disbursement? It is very much parallel to EQIP, as you'll see. Most of the practices that we incentivize depend upon practice standards from NRCS, which are modified for the particular state that you're in. Exceptions to that so far have been compost and whole orchard recycling. The fundamental structure of the program is that we pay twice as much as EQIP does, but only for 3 years or 1 year if it's a one-time planting, basically. And every field can only be covered once by the program. This is aimed at adoption and demonstrating that farmers can get past the initial risk or adaptation phase in a particular practice. Next slide, please. Thinking back on all the practices that we have available to them, particular ones that leap out to me at any rate as being relevant to the Delta context would be riparian plantings, crop rotation, hedgerows, windbreaks, and cover crops. There's also mention in the strategy of prioritizing stacked practices. Really to be able to carry out more systemic agro-ecosystem changes instead of just trying one practice for the first time. And the Healthy Soils Program has recently adapted in that direction to give priority to multi-practice projects. It is worth noting that compost and whole orchard recycling are not incentivized on soils with more than 20% soil organic matter because of the doubtful benefit of those practices in greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration. And all of this is underpinned by modeling that is done and really controlled by CARB. And lastly, I just wanted to bring out, instead of whole orchard recycling, now that we see more perennials and more orchards coming into the Delta, and we also see an excess of woody biomass statewide, it does seem to me that mulching could be preferable to tilling in the chips insofar as it fights weeds and could help with water conservation and involve less movement of the soil here, which imperils fundamentally the soil here in the Delta conditions. I'll go to the next slide. Okay, moving forward, what sorts of changes might we see in the Healthy Soils Program? We have not put out an incentive yet, similar to what Campbell was talking about to support conversion to rice, but we have it listed as a demonstration, which is to say a research or outreach oriented project type that we made available. It was called Resaturating Delta Peat Soils Through Rice Cultivation. No one proposed research or an outreach project using these dollars, and so to some extent we're waiting on a little bit more of research, but also we can review again the methodologies that were developed by the Delta Conservancy. There is a bit of a disagreement in modeling approaches between Air Resources Board and some other bodies that affects us. I saw biochar was mentioned here in the strategy. It could have an interesting particular application in the Delta for keeping carbon sequestered for a greater amount of time in soils that can be flooded or that could use better drainage capacity, particularly when they're getting to the end of the peat layer. And it's worth noting that in a few months, we will likely be opening ourselves up to new proposals for new practices that would be supported in our program. Lastly, I will mention there is not online yet, but there is under development the carbon sequestration registry that was mandated by SB 27. I think it was a year and a half ago or something like that, which is probably not going to open up during this year, probably open up during 2025. But this is a voluntary markets registry where, from our point of view in our program, we can list projects that we have not been able to fund so that other state agency, local governments, or philanthropic organizations or private actors could see the possibility of supporting particular projects and who they would contact. But there are a lot of details still being worked out about the SB 27 registry. Next slide. I'll say a few words about the SWEEP Irrigation Efficiency Grant Program, partly because it is becoming more relevant to the Delta context. It's different. It's structured differently from the Healthy Soils. This is a reimbursement for a particular quoted project with that goes up to $200,000 per project. They must simultaneously reduce water applications to land and energy use or greenhouse gas emissions. That could be a real problem in the Delta. The way that the program has been quantified up until now, because people aren't pumping water into their fields typically, so there's not much to reduce in energy use. But we will be able to show greater benefits with irrigation efficiency with a new calculator that we have on coming online, which allows us to quantify the nitrous oxide benefits of switching to some sort of micro irrigation, and that has nitrous oxide impacts by itself, but it also implies lower applications of nitrogen typically because it's more efficient. I will mention about equity, which they asked us to say a few words about. With SWEEP, as with Healthy Soils, we set aside at least 25% of program funding to go to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. I don't know how that lines up with the profile of people in the Delta, but in the state as a whole, we can safely say that at least 20% of farmers and ranchers already naturally fall into that group. So it's not the most ambitious bar for us to be meeting. Next slide. It is worth understanding that the SWEEP Irrigation Efficiency Program has a great deal of flexibility to it. It does not have a set list of practices from which you must choose. However, typically they would fall into some of these practices that you see, like installing weather stations or moisture sensors or solar power if electric pumps are present, so that you could show a reduction in energy use. All sorts of irrigation components affecting efficiency of energy use or of water use. Next slide. I'll broaden the focus out a little bit, speaking about our office, what we call OFI, which is basically all different types of incentives. There's the Conservation Agriculture Planning Grants Program, which allows farmers to get full freight support for the development of a conservation ag plan. Often that opens up the door for them to equip funds. It's very often done through a technical service provider from equip. Then there's the Organic Transition Pilot Program. I'm not aware how well organic is rooted or is growing in the Delta, but this is a real this is a new program that offers real opportunities for a leg up for converting particular acres to organic and getting some associated equipment purchases. Then there's the Pollinator Habitat Program. Both birds and bees are pollinators. I know that there's a great deal of concern about biodiversity and about flyways and different avian species coming through the delta. So that is a right target, I think. And lastly, the Water Efficiency Technical Assistance Program, which allows farmers to get free assessments of their water use systems, and that could get interesting in the delta, I would say, in the flexible way that improvements could be suggested to people's systems. Last slide, I guess. I'm not sure how much time there is. Yeah, I imagine I'm probably about out of time. This was just a mention of the partnerships that are brought out a bit in the strategy, and there's not really time to dwell on them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open it up to council member thoughts.
I have a few questions just to unpack some information that was there. Thank you. This was a lot of info. And you mentioned that there's a discrepancy of air resources board calculations. Could you shed some light on that, or I heard that wrong?
No, you did hear that correctly. For example, the literature reviews and modeling that might underpin the Delta Conservancy's carbon sequestration calculations or their involvement with the American Carbon Registry are not the same as what the Air Resources Board would demand that we show through their standard modeling approaches. So that has been a barrier up until now. It's one reason that practice was kept in the demonstration category for more modeling and just possibly.
Do you see at some point that it has to come on the same page?
I hope so, yeah.
Because they also have regulatory authority and they can.
Yes, regulatory authority over different areas, yeah.
Some point.
Yeah, we are absolutely subject to the Air Resources Board's final say on what is certified as a greenhouse gas reducing practice.
And is there work going in order to bring these two on the same page?
There was a great deal of discussion, and there's the potential for renewed work on that soon. Yeah.
Okay, good. And then my second question was on the page where you had the HSP practice. I think from the way conceptually I understand this, because it's technical information, what's really the recycled of orchards versus, the other mulch and something else. So this is basically clarifying what works and doesn't work from all this different planting, right?
Well, specifically about the compost and whole orchard recycling, we do not incentivize them in the most peaty soils, the highest organic matter soils, because they would have they don't show a benefit in modeling for carbon sequestration, and indeed you would be moving the soil additionally quite a lot for the whole orchard recycling example. But other ones that I mentioned at the top of that slide were just my face of it impressions of which of our incentives are most useful for the sorts of habitat and adaptation approaches that we are promoting in the Delta.
What is stacked practice?
Stacked means preferring projects where people want to undertake a greater change than simply trying compost as the classic practice, or trying cover crop. They might be putting hedgerows along the sides of their fields, selecting a cover crop variety that matches that somehow, and mixing that in with, mulch in some other part of the field or compost application, basically more systemic changes.
Okay, and then last question I have, in terms of funding mechanisms, I'm just thinking that there's going to be many different funding mechanisms for this, or, both water, air, everybody's interested in this, so.
Yeah, well, we are funded by a varying mix generally between the general fund and greenhouse gas reduction dollars from cap and trade. And so I think historically more than half of it has come from greenhouse gas reduction, and that's why our approach has to be so constrained by the modeling and the impacts assessed by the Air Resources Board.
Very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm going to take Councilmember Zingali and then Councilmember Bergen.
Thank you. Thanks for this presentation. You mentioned the equity relief available to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And I'm just wondering, is any of that available to farm workers themselves, the workers? I guess my broader question is, are farm workers, agricultural workers, seasonal workers included in our outreach, participation, contributions to this strategy?
It's an interesting question. I'll just say quickly about the Healthy Soils program, but it seems like Morgan can respond about the general population issue. The people who are incentivized, who can be sometimes not people so much as corporate entities, are either landowners or people who are leasing land. So no, someone who is simply a farm worker is not a recipient of Healthy Soils assistance.
Yeah, and I can try and speak to the other question about farm workers' input in our strategies. We didn't speak for the grower interviews that we've mentioned that we did in partnership with CDFA. We didn't speak directly to farm workers themselves, but as part of our environmental and tribal justice work, we have engaged with community organizations that do work, they themselves work more with farm workers. So that's been part of our outreach related to that work that has been folded in as much as possible to our strategies. But there hasn't been like direct conversations with farm workers as it.
Are those organizations you're talking about, Morgan, are those organizations that represent farm workers specifically, like farm worker organizations?
Yeah, those organizations have been included in our outreach list, and I'd have to look back at the interviews we did with organizations to see how many are incorporated, but that's been part of our environmental and tribal justice research.
Thank you. I'd be interested if they've contributed to this strategy around agriculture on the subject of equity. Thank you.
Councilmember Burke.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on the former questions. What percentage of the economy is farm agriculture? Because when we talk about equity, it looks like we're really focusing on ag, and I know with what you do, that's what you focus on. But I'm curious what other types of businesses that aren't being considered as far as equity goes, because and then piggybacking on that, is there a way of investing in the new technologies, the ancillary services, like he was asking about farm workers, the other supportive businesses that work in ag that we could help lift people up to have, the skills that we're talking about levee, technology, we're talking about moisture and the different types of irrigation systems. Is there a way of creating equity, but also maybe lifting people up so that that type of work is better?
I can say a quick word just about the greenhouse gas reduction funds. The California Climate Investments has training and workforce development as one of the benefits that is preferred in their prioritized in their funding of projects. It's generally hard to demonstrate with Healthy Soils projects that you're training someone or creating a workforce. On the other hand, when we give great amounts of funding for whole orchard recycling or for compost, we are supporting nascent industries and people are getting trained and businesses are getting started, absolutely.
That,
But in broader state policy, that is a factor with the disbursement of greenhouse gas reduction funds.
yeah, I see bringing in the, the college districts and bringing in those types of programs on the ground here in the Delta to help them even visualize that is a possibility. The next question I had was related to crop studies. We talk about subvention, and that basically is the work that we're doing with rice cultivation is basically flooding so that we can work on subvention. And someone talked about what other crops, and from my understanding, the only crop that works with the flooding is rice. Is that correct?
I'm not an expert on the subject, but what about wild rice, which isn't rice? Yeah, I'm not an expert on which other. People talk about tules, but then that's
Tules
like a
isn't really-
native crop for
Right.
for indigenous traditional uses, for
Right.
example.
And that's not really a crop that we can, because when Campbell was speaking, he was talking about the carbon sequestration and the rice being something that helps provide the funding for the maintenance and all that kind of thing. I would really, and I've said this before, I'll say it in this room, I think we need to figure out if there's other crops so that when farmers need to or want to rotate, whether it's because of the market or because of conditions, that they have those other options. And I think that would be really good. I also am curious that, I was reading that there's drip irrigation and all of this that Israel's doing with rice, and there's these other things. So it could become a crop that isn't as in demand if there's other ways of doing it in less expensive ways. So that was, I would like to encourage that. And then the last thing, I don't know the answer to this question. I try to usually ask questions that I know the answer to, but what percentage of watering for ag in the Delta is from wells versus surface water?
I don't know if the
Okay.
question is
Yeah, I'm just
directed.
curious because I don't think everybody realizes that they're dependent on the water in the Delta often to water their crops, and that is a part of the formula. So, all right, those were my comments or questions.
Did you want to?
I just mentioned, that's a new law in California called Sigma that's going to start monitoring wells, but I guess the data isn't in yet, but once we do, we'll have a better idea.
I had a question, if I could.
Thank you, council members. Any other?
Yes, so I have a, a follow-up question. Michael, thank you so much. Seems like it's program and initiative. Two things, and pardon me because I can only hear from one ear with this congestion. The sweep grants, how long have they been around?
Since 2014, I think.
Okay. Do you have any data in terms of how much of the grants have gone to the disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, and tribe? Specifically, I'm asking on the tribal members. What percentage since 2014 of the sweep grants have gone to these disadvantaged entities that you?
I could get back to you about that later
That would be
in
great.
coordination with the sweep team.
Excellent, thank you. And then I wanted to kind of piggyback on what Councilmember Burgess was talking about. Given that we're looking at some long-term scenarios in that the Delta is not going to yield as much ag product, as Councilmember Burgess mentioned, workforce training, I think is going to be essential. And I think about the farm workers, as just were mentioned right now, that maybe are not part of any kind of grant moving forward. Maybe that is something that we could work with your organization, maybe helping again to identify training programs for the future on, what these crop rotations may look like, so that we can actually start working on outreach to these communities that have come here for that very reason, to work. And if they start taking a look at, their volatility, if you will, and looking at their future, that they may not have, again, the ability to be able to produce income for their families, to start again looking at what does ag look like on the short term and the long term, to provide economic vitality for some of these communities that again don't qualify for grants in the traditional form. And tooling, we talked about rice. What other crops? What have we explored further with the Native American community on tooling themselves? Is that something that we should explore for, again, on a grander scale, if you will? Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree that there's room to think more systematically about workforce training and development and adaptation. The CDFA is involved in a few particular local projects, but really doesn't have a statewide program for agricultural workforce development. I'm afraid I've declared myself not an expert on aquatic crops.
Thank you so much. Right, I'd like to take this opportunity to turn to the in-person audience. Carly will come around to those with their hands raised for contributions to the discussion.
Hi, Amber McDowell with Sacramento County Farm Bureau. I can answer a lot of those questions on SWEEP. I was a technical assistant in San Joaquin County and also here in Sacramento County. While that money does go towards the farm entity, the owners of that, it pretty much goes straight out of their pocket to our supporting agribusinesses, such as the irrigation companies, the sensor companies, and all that stuff, which then builds up that economy in our local community, which is going out to a lot of those farm workers. As we're adding in this new technology, the farm workers are getting more training to be able to manage and utilize that technology on the farm. So there is a lot of collaboration there. As for disadvantaged communities, a lot of it was based originally off of who's getting those impacts from the greenhouse gases. And those were kind of how a lot of those community boundaries were set up, of who is actually living in those zones. The Delta does have most of that area that can get in that 25% that they have to meet for the requirements by law for the funding of those programs there. Just on those programs, our farmers are really happy to see these programs. It is helping them to upgrade and improve their systems that they do have on their farms to be more economical, be able to provide more products or services, hire more people. It does help ease them, especially when we're being bombarded with a lot more regulatory fees and requirements that are costing them more money, and with the markets kind of not being stabilized. Lastly, I do want to make a comment that what I have noticed in the Delta is, because we are really a high priority area of, we have water where the Southern and the Valley do not have those, we are getting more Valley and Southern California people moving into the Delta. With that, they are bringing their ideas and past experiences of farming in the Valley to the Delta, which cannot be farmed the exact same way. Just on Grand Island, we had 2 different entities that have come in to put in permanent crops, which is fine to some degree, but they did not ask any of the locals about what the situation is there. They tried to dip into peat soils, which was going to open up, springs in our area there. They have torn out all of the ditches that are drainage. So now they're flooding our island because it's not draining properly. Which also, in my opinion, with these ditches, those are huge areas of wildlife corridors. They live there, they move from field to field there. So having these smaller fields with these ditches really does help with the wildlife and habitat. And so pulling all these ditches is really changing the dynamics of agriculture and how our islands can survive with the water. And then going back to the water, how much is being used from wells and pumping, you also have to realize in the Delta, our water table is sometimes only about 3 feet to 6 feet deep. Our trees are sub-irrigating themselves directly out of that river water table. So to measure how much water is being utilized is really hard because we don't actually have to do it. Now, if we put in such as like the tunnel and we drop our river 18 inches or more, it's going to drop that river table on the islands more. We're going to have to pump water now into the island to sustain those crops, which means we will be putting out more greenhouse gases. So those are just a few of my points.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Melinda Terry again, and I just want to point out that I'm hoping you are also looking at coordinating with the Delta Protection Commission. I hope I'm going to remember the date right, but I think, we're looking back at 1992 and your organization, they were asked to do a plan. It's called the Land Use and Resource Management Plan. And so I'm hoping you are coordinating with them because the last time it was updated was, I believe, around the same time that the Stewardship Council approved its very first plan. So for them, it was an update. And, but they are trying to address in particular agriculture. And as far as I know, it's the only place in the state when they created the legal delta and this primary zone and secondary zone. It's the only place I'm aware of in the state that statutorily in the primary zone prohibits like widespread development of private land. Now, the locals were happy about that because they want to remain in farming, but just really keep that in mind. The farming and these crops are the highest and best use of this property. And I think Erin also, just in closing, well, I didn't do one water quality thing, water supply, but the drainage is very important. These reclamation districts that maintain the levee, a lot of what they're doing every day is having to drain off because the water table is so low. Shallow, and so they are draining it just to keep it dry enough to farm, but that all changes, as we were saying, with changes in surface water elevation of the sloughs and the river. I have to go to another appointment, but for the water supply, the other thing to understand is there's thousands of individual diversion intakes in the sloughs and the river, and a lot of them are siphons. So the use of gravity and any changes that happen on the land side and the water side can really affect the efficiency and the ability to be able to irrigate. So I hope you'll look at those things. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Melinda. Any other comments from the room? Okay, seeing none, I'll shift over to our virtual participants. Emma, do we have anyone virtually that'd like to contribute to the discussion?
We do. We have Sarah Medina. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Medina, the Sustainable Agriculture and Land Manager at Restore the Delta. I want to express my appreciation for the attention given to the agriculture section in the Delta Adapts Plan. I commend the acknowledgement of rice cultivation and wetland restoration / mitigation as a solution given its numerous benefits. While promoting rice farming in a positive step, I propose additional incentives to encourage farmers' active participation in such solutions, specifically addressing the conversion amount. Currently available resources typically span only 1 to 3 years. Expanding these fund periods would be beneficial to truly realize the benefits of the transition, but to also study the periods that we want to look into specifically with cover crops. I know it was mentioned throughout the conversation about the different types that could be beneficial, but given how some projects are just starting out, specifically with rice farming, there needs to be more time given for farmers to really see the benefits of switching to crop cover crops. Regarding the carbon sequestration with rice farming, there will be a significant need for education on the carbon market due to the time-intensive nature of the process. Technical assistance for landlords will also be essential as well to be able to participate in grant programs mentioned by Michael from CDFA. They're great programs, but some of the landowners and farmers don't even know they're available. The report also highlights wetland restoration. To enhance its effectiveness, a more comprehensive outreach and education effort should be implemented to inform both farmers and surrounding communities about the environmental benefits. It is crucial to engage not only farmers, but also the broader community for a thorough understanding of these advantages. Further clarification is needed in the report regarding compensating farmers for retiring their farmland, addressing concerns about the feasibility of such requests, and exploring how these transitions could open a new job market opportunity is essential. Additionally, the report should emphasize actively involving tribes while cultural correctiveness and sensitivity to meet these goals. I would also like to highlight the importance of proper water flow for the effectiveness of these solutions. Without addressing this aspect, the success of proposed measures may be compromised. In conclusion, while the report addresses critical issues in the Delta, I appreciate the progress it made. I also look forward to seeing the finished product, and thank you for your effort.
Thank you so much. Emma, do we have anyone else online that would like to contribute?
We do. We have Deirdre Desjardins. You should be able to speak.
Thank you. One thing, there is new research on climate science. We've had, as you know, the last decade has seen an extensive drought, and the worst drought, as measured by soil moisture deficit in 1,200 years in the Southwest. And California has also been experiencing a precipitation deficit. And there's new research showing that that's likely due to anthropogenic forcing, and the decadal scale drought will continue. And we did raise in the focus group the issue that rice takes a lot of water per acre, more than almost any other crop. So it's not going to be feasible to grow in the dry and critically dry years like we saw in 2021 and 2022, when not only was there not water to grow rice in the Delta, the upstream cultivation of rice in the Sacramento Valley was grossly curtailed. So I'm really concerned that this strategy isn't consistent with curtailment of water in the Delta, and they do propose that growers reduce their curtail their irrigation water by 25% during dry periods such as we had. You can't do climate adaptation without adapting to increased frequency of dry and critically dry years, and there are also hot droughts, so there's less runoff. And again, salinity intrusion is really harmful to crops. The asparagus growers on Sherman Island went out of business when there's salinity intrusion in soil. It damages crops. Chip Salmon gave heartbreaking testimony about trying to keep his walnut trees alive in the South Delta, and he just couldn't do it. I mean, he had all kinds of consultants, and it was because of salinity intrusion. So keeping Delta agriculture viable is going to require better salinity management. And again, that's looking at reservoir operations upstream to meet the water quality control plan requirements, because those protect agricultural uses in the Delta. Thank you.
Thank you. Emma, anyone else online that would like to contribute? No. Okay, not at this time. All right. So we'll move right along. I'm going to hand it back to Annie Merritt, and we're going to start. Oh, and Tom, could you come up to the panelist table, please? Thank you. And Louise, I think I saw you in the crowd. You're back. Oh, good. Louise Conrad, thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, if you could start showing the slides, please, to the water supply slides. So maybe I'll just go ahead and get started. So as I think all of us know, the Delta watershed provides a portion of the water supply for about 27 million Californians and millions of acres of agricultural lands. And sorry, can you, maybe you're already doing it, but advance the slide, please, a couple times. So yeah, so the Delta is very important for water supply throughout the whole state and including people who live in the Delta. So with climate change, though, water supply will likely decrease while demand will likely increase due to impacts like more extreme heat, more variable precipitation, decreased snowpack, and sea level rise. And then water supply infrastructure will be at greater risk from various climate change impacts. So as we've noted with the other strategies, these water supply strategies build from and go beyond what's already in the Delta Plan and the Delta Reform Act. So the Delta Plan lays a foundation for water supply adaptation through a number of policies and recommendations. So just a few examples. There's a Delta Plan policy that requires water suppliers to reduce reliance on the Delta through improved regional self-reliance. The Delta Reform Act describes Delta conveyance facilities as contributing to water supply reliability. And additionally, we want to note that in 2018, the Council amended the Delta Plan with an update for promoting options for water conveyance, storage, and operations of both. So this amendment endorses a form of what we call dual conveyance, but it does not specify exactly what that should entail, and it does not endorse any specific project. So our Delta Adapts strategies are aligned with that Delta Plan amendment. So onto the strategies themselves. So in the middle of the slide here, like before, that lists the 5 water supply adaptation strategy topics and a few examples of supporting actions. So the first strategy is to reduce reliance on the Delta by improving regional self-reliance through conservation and developing local water supplies. So the lead for this we named as, water suppliers and utilities. And then this strategy has 6 supporting actions. So just a couple examples would be funding pilot projects that promote urban and agricultural water conservation or use of recycled water, and coordinating with local and regional agencies to develop an interbasin groundwater budget. The second strategy is to increase local storage of surface and groundwater supplies north and south of the Delta. The lead for this would be water suppliers. So there's 5 supporting actions for this one. For example, streamlining processes to make it easier for private landowners to use their fields for groundwater recharge, and investing in planning activities for flood managed aquifer recharge. The next strategy is to modify reservoir operations to adapt to changing climate conditions. The lead for this would be reservoir operators. We have 4 supporting actions for this strategy. So just one example is to review and modify existing flood control curves to consider climate variability. The next strategy is to review and consider modifying water quality standards to develop climate-informed objectives for agricultural uses fishing, recreational, tribal, and other human beneficial uses of water. The lead for this would be the State Water Resources Control Board. And this strategy has 8 supporting actions. So just one example is to continue supporting the development of a comprehensive monitoring program for harmful algal blooms in the Delta. And this is a good example of an equity issue, as harmful algal blooms disproportionately impact certain parts of the Delta. And then the last strategy is to improve or modify infrastructure in the Delta to minimize the impacts of through Delta conveyance. So the lead for this would be DWR. This strategy has 5 supporting actions. And so one example is to protect and maintain a freshwater pathway through the central Delta. And next slide, please. So while we're waiting for that, so next we will hear from Tom Zuckerman, who represents an array of interests in the Delta, including the Central Delta Water Agency. So Tom will speak to how some of the water supply strategies relate to his work, specifically the need for groundwater recharge, levees for protecting water supply, and the need for reservoir operations to be adaptable. So go ahead, Tom.
That might help. Sounds like it did. I've been at this for a long time, 56 years since I got involved in resource issues that pertain not just to the Delta, but to the whole state. And I have views. I hope I don't offend people in stating them here, but a lot of them tend to be a little bit critical of the way we've proceeded in the last several generations. And I want to apologize in advance if I offend anybody. Global warming is not the cause of the lack of water supply sufficiency in the Delta. It aggravates it, but it's an underlying problem that relates from the fact that we never really developed the supplies that were committed to the contractors for the State Water Project, particularly, as well as the Central Valley Project. When for instance, the State Water Project was conceptualized, the idea was they would need to develop an additional 5 million acre-feet of firm yield off of development of the North Coast rivers in order to meet the commitments that the State Water Project was making in the valley, in some of the urban areas in Northern California, and largely to Southern California. For good reasons, those projects were never developed. It started during the Reagan administration with Ike Livermore's buddy up on the Eel River, and the Eel River was going to be the first of those projects. It was discarded, and then under Jerry Brown's administration, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed, which put the other North Coast rivers out of bounds. So we start off with a $5 million acre-foot deficit in the State Water Project itself. At the same time, when we were going through the Water Quality Control Plan procedures with the State Water Resources Control Board, there was a recognition that they didn't have sufficient knowledge at that time to set adequate water quality standards to protect the fisheries in the Delta. And they weren't even really talking about salmon at that point or smelt. They were talking about striped bass, interestingly enough. So subsequent requirements that have been imposed, which haven't really been sufficient in themselves, but have created large needs for additional Delta outflow and has also reduced the available water supply for export. So we're down to the point where we start off with what probably is about an 8 million acre foot deficit in firm yield to supply the Delta and the various water projects over a recurrence of the historical dry period. Now that's something that the Delta Adapts doesn't really talk about. They talk about what the impact of the coming global warming is going to create, and that's an additional overlay on this. So we have what is a very, very serious water supply deficiency in the system. I think everybody needs to acknowledge that. I had the privilege of writing a white paper back in 2007, now it's 17 years ago, which was submitted to the Blue Ribbon Committee in the CalFed process that identified this problem. The next year, the Bureau of Reclamation came out with a report that identified the shortages in these two projects being unable to meet the demands of their customers at the level of about 6 million acre feet. So this is not something that we've invented this year. It's a problem that's been acknowledged all the way back to 1978 when the State Water Resources Control Board issued Decision 1485 and acknowledged that in order to meet the needs of the fisheries in the Delta, they would have to shut down the water projects in the dry years. So anyway, that's just a dash of cold water to throw, on the system here. And what can we do about it? That's the next thing. We know we're going to have to reduce the reliance upon the Delta. The water supply is just not there in order to meet the critical needs of the Delta, not just for agriculture, but to support the environment, the recreational activities, and some of the human uses that are made of the system. So the conclusion that I reached some time ago is that we have to recognize that we've systematically created a reservoir that has a capacity of over 500 million acre feet of storage capability by overdrafting the groundwater of the San Joaquin Valley. And we need to use that under SGMA, which we now have, as a way of putting some funds in the bank account so that when we come into these dry year periods, we're not relying upon flow into the Delta from the streams and the upstream reservoirs in order to meet the water needs of the contractors for the state and the federal projects and the other people that rely upon those needs. That's a very important concept. You don't have to go out and build a bunch of new dams. You can use the existing foothill reservoirs. There's a political problem, but the physical problem is there. You can use them to regulate the flow of the rivers that's coming into the system during the normal seasons, release that water to the groundwater recharge projects, which will be transported to the areas through the natural channels of the river in most cases. That'll have very positive benefits on the environment of each of those river systems. It'll increase the storage capability by using the groundwater facility, and it will increase flood control by keeping the reservoirs emptier going into the flood season so that they will be able to capture more water. Now that's all set out in this plan that I referred to earlier. Just a couple of details as to that I would like to mention here about it is that Sites Reservoir appears to be the only viable project that's being talked about for more storage now. And there was a version of Sites Reservoir that made a lot of sense when it was originally put forth, which has been, I think, eliminated. And that is to take water directly from Shasta Dam to the Sites Reservoir through some kind of like a pipeline conveyance, and not release the water into the Sacramento River and have to redivert it at the Red Bluff Diversion Dam, which is a real problem for the native fisheries in the Sacramento River. If you put that diversion structure at the top of the dam, you would have some physical assurance that the water that was going to be diverted into sites would really be surplus flow from the Sacramento River. Then you've protected the cold water pool behind behind Shasta Dam and the fisheries that are dependent upon the whole system would not be threatened by this site's reservoir. I just wanted to mention that because I think sites is getting into people's focus these days, and I hope that they'll take another look at how the design of that project is supposed to work. What else did you want me to talk about? Okay. Well, hard to condense 56 years of frustration into 10 minutes, but I hope I made it in 11.
Okay, so we're gonna have another speaker and then we'll have opportunity for comments and questions. So now we'll hear from Louise Conrad, who's the lead scientist for the Department of Water Resources. And Louise will talk about some of DWR's work related to some of our water supply strategies, but she'll also touch on work just related to some of the other focus areas as well.
Thank you. Hopefully this is working. Thanks for the chance to be here today and for hearing me out. I'll keep it short at the end of the workshop. So I want to just first acknowledge and appreciate the forum here. This is a hard project. The Delta Adapts project is a really difficult one, as I think all the public comment is showing here that there's a lot of issues at play. And we appreciate the council's very systematic approach in developing a vulnerability assessment and then a Delta Adapt strategy that really speaks specifically to the Delta stressors in particular. This comprehensive strategy is going to be very useful given that there are multiple stressors, and really we appreciate that there's been partnered modeling work, including with Department of Water Resources, in developing the vulnerability assessment. And we believe this approach supports a more generalized understanding of the issues and potential adaptation strategies moving forward. So for my remarks today, I would like to speak to DWR's work with respect to the water supply, but also the ecosystem aspect. And then finally, just acknowledge that this Delta Adapts effort is one of a suite of collaborative efforts to address climate resilience for the region. So we can go to the next slide. Please. Okay, so I want to, as kind of a take home, describe DWR priorities really do lie in partnership and innovation around these challenges. I'll speak a little bit today to nature-based approaches to achieve multiple benefits, modernization and innovation for water quality and supply. And so on that piece particularly, we are very committed to advancing science and innovation for these challenges. The sobering fact, I think, as the climate vulnerability assessment states and other documents, is that climate-driven weather extremes are changing precipitation patterns and overall across the state threatening our water supply. California is expected to lose 10% of its water supply by 2040. So Jeff Henderson's comments at the very beginning, the time is now, there is urgency, are well taken. In particular, in the Delta, the infrastructure is also vulnerable to flood and also seismic activity. So without upgrades to speak to the State Water Project as one of the major roles for DWR, it's a decades-old infrastructure, and updates are needed. Water supply will continue to decline without those and then threaten the security for 27 million people. To this end, I want to note that Department of Water Resources is working on a climate adaptation analysis for the State Water Project that could support this effort for Delta Adapts. This report is due to be completed this fall, and it will show how the State Water Project is adapting to climate and taking in specific strategies such as forecast-informed reservoir operations and Delta conveyance, which Annie Merritt spoke to earlier, and will support water supply reliability as a goal, as well as drought resilience and improved ecological conditions. So with that in mind, and acknowledging that the State Water Project must do its part to adapt to increasing climate stressors, We also want to highlight that the toolbox for adaptation has to go beyond the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. And we recommend and are encouraged to see the direction that we're hearing today, that the Delta Adapts strategy consider other water supply entities and other tools for water supply and how they can be part of that regional adaptation for supply. The Council's own vulnerability assessment, we've talked about this a little bit, describes a high likelihood that the Delta exports decline by up to 20% by 2050. And as well as reduced reliability for in-Delta diversions due to salinity intrusion. So there needs to be innovations, and we want to point to a positive example from the city of Antioch with the brackish water desalination project. Will promote drought resilience by allowing the city to pump water from the San Joaquin River throughout the year, even during dry periods when the river is typically too saline, and providing up to 6 million gallons per day. So while that's not the whole of the need, these steps are in a good direction to expand our toolbox. And then I also want to acknowledge FloodMar, Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, that has already come up as a really important strategy for promoting the recharge of groundwater during floods, reducing flood risk, and enhancing water supply. And at DWR, we are deeply committed to advancing that strategy. And then within the Delta, I want to have just note generally that there's trade-offs at play all the time. We operate with awareness of that trade-off, and we really like to see this challenge of trade-offs be included in the Delta Adapts strategy. I want to note that previous Department of Water Resources lead scientist Dr. Ted Summer often talk about these trade-offs with the age-old phrase of "there's no free lunch" in the Delta. If you do something to adjust the system in one way, you get a shift in an area you might not have been targeting. And for a quick example of this, the biological opinion and the incidental take permit for the State Water Project includes the summer-fall operation of the Suisun Marsh salinity control gates. And the intent of the action is to provide benefits for Delta smelt habitat in Suisun Marsh region. But this often, in the years that it operates, comes at a water cost because operation of the gates causes the salinity field to move further upstream, and then it's necessary to release more water from upstream storage to meet Delta fisheries standards and water quality standards. So that's just an example. We could move to the next slide. I want to shift my focus for a moment to ecosystem restoration. We are working with partners to advance landscape scale habitat restoration in the Delta. This is consistent with the focus on ecosystems, that aspect of the Delta Adapts strategy, and the state's priority to accelerate nature-based solutions. So as you can see on this slide, we are in the process of planning and constructing over 35,000 acres of tidal, floodplain, and riparian habitat in the Delta region, and agree this is a really critical piece to resilience. The approach for many projects is to achieve multiple benefits to support climate resilience. And if we can go to the next slide. This is a focus on the Yolo Bypass and Cash Slough Complex Corridor. And these projects highlighted in green, for example, include Lookout Slough, which is pictured here, Lower Yolo Ranch, the Lower Elkhorn Basin Levee Setback Project, as well as Little Eggbrook Track. Their primary purpose, many of them, is to restore and connect habitats for the purpose of improving the regional food web and providing habitat for native fishes. I mean, collectively, along this corridor, they will also enhance the capacity for floodwater conveyance, and while also factoring in sea level rise. And during the execution, the planning and design of each of these projects, DWR is consulting with the local community, including tribes, to incorporate relevant design elements for these communities, while also ensuring consistency with the Delta Plan. So I think we already talked about the Sherman and Twitchell Islands as part of Campbell Ingram's presentation. That's another we see as a multi-benefit project. Those management of those lands for carbon sequestration and subsidence reversal. And just another example of our investment for these multi-benefit projects. And so we can go to the next slide. I'm going to close with a thank you. And again, for being here, and a picture of floodwater conveyance in the Yolo bypass region there. Overall, as I mentioned at the top, we see the Delta Adapts efforts as part of a suite of collaborative efforts that are supporting adaptation. And all of these are important because they serve as venues for enhancing available information and tools. So one great example is actually within the Delta Stewardship Council wheelhouse generally is the Delta Science Program Salinity Management Workshop, which engages partners that are expert modelers, including one that is from DWR, to advance our modeling tools for eventually understanding landscape changes and their impacts on water quality and supply if current regulations for salinity stay in place. And so having these tools and advancing them is really important, but what is also beneficial about the salinity management workshop and other efforts like it is that there's an opportunity to share these tools transparently, publicly, and to get input on the scenarios that are beneficial to model with them. And we do hope that the Delta Adapts strategy and other efforts can have some uptake of these advanced tools. And if there's any living document aspect to the Delta Adapts strategy that can continue to promote the advancement of these tools. Some other venues that I just want to mention really quickly are the Collaboratory for Equity and Water Allocations, Co-Equal, and Just Transitions. And DWR is engaged in these venues as part of its technical and steering committees, and we are supporting them for the same reason as the Delta Adapts effort, Salinity Management Workshop, because they offer this advancement and innovation in a collaborative way. So finally, thank you again for a chance to be here and ready to work in partnership with the Stewardship Council to further develop the plan for adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise and Tom, for your thoughts. I'd like to open it up to council members if you have any contributions for Chair Medwania.
So to Tom Zuckerman, thank you for your presentation. 56 years of work added with frustration. And I thought you did it in a very good way. You mentioned a lot of your concerns, a lot of the frustrations that you've encountered over your work. But I also appreciate that you had some suggestions with regard to Shasta sites and sites obviously being a really good possibility for storage. But Tom, I think there were two things that maybe you did not mention. Thought maybe I'd give you the opportunity to address those.
Yeah, I'm sorry for being long-winded. One of the things I wanted to stress is the importance of the Delta levee system and the need that we have to provide some consistent source of funding to maintain it. Even if, which I think is unlikely, tunnel project is ever built, 85% of the water that is going to be exported from the Delta is still going to come through the Delta channels. So the absence of having good levees in the Delta will jeopardize the ability to transfer that water. And I would refer to the staff of the Metropolitan Water District to confirm what I just said. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and Louise and I were both there 2 days ago at the National Academy of Science thing, a great deal of discussion about the Delta smelt problem. And I think it's pretty well supportable and recognized that the real problem with the Delta smelt population was probably the construction of the Montezuma Slough control structure. And what that allowed to happen was the salting up of Grizzly Bay and Suisun Bay. The duck hunters and wetland managers in the Suisun Marsh were encouraged to cut off the dendritic channels that flow in and out of the marsh from those bays, which cut off a lot of the habitat. The saltwater increases encouraged the establishment of the filter feeding clams, which took over the habitat in those shallow areas. And basically, the purchase of Sherman Island and Twitchell by the Department of Water Resources allowed the water quality standard to be moved further upstream. And all these things combine to deprive the smell of their prime production area, the mixing zone, so-called, of the estuary. The only apparently viable environment for the smell anymore is the mixing zone in the Sacramento Deepwater Channel, which is really not a very good spot for propagation and establishment of a Delta smelt population. So we need to realize that we do really need to reduce reliance upon the Delta, that we're going to have to reestablish a healthy environment. We're not going to be able to do it with habitat projects alone. The water flow into the areas that support these organisms is going to be really, really critical going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the council members at this time? Okay, I'd like to open it up to our audience members in person. Just raise your hand and Carly will come to you. It's a big room.
Hi, Ian Nomalini Jr. I'm an attorney with the Central Delta Water Agency. I didn't know we were going to have so many people here, but this is very important. And I also represent some reclamation districts. I haven't been participating in the focus group, so I don't know where you're at, but it sounds like the plan is close to coming out. So I hope to see, and I would encourage you to add, if it's not there, I would hope to see some exploration of physical barrier type of solutions to control salinity. I believe maybe you are talking about this in your plan, but if not, you should. And I'll be honest, I didn't know what a SILL was, S-I-L-L, until a couple years ago. But a SILL is like a speed bump. When I thought of salinity gates, I thought of the False River Gate, where it's a complete blockage of the river, and that causes problems with fish, boats. But the SILL is like a speed bump along the bottom of the channel. Apparently, the salinity, it travels mostly on the bottom. And when I looked at the research on these types of projects like sills and gates, they basically decided back then that we're going to go with a hydrological solution. We're not going to build these structures. We're going to rely on the reservoirs to release fresh water. We're going to keep the Delta fresh. Well, everything we're talking about is telling us that relying on the reservoirs isn't going to cut it anymore. So I would urge you to please dust this topic off and start encouraging the exploration of speed bumps, other ways to control salinity without having to release storage water. That would benefit everybody, I believe. Lastly, I would like to see you folks to start encouraging the use of San Luis Reservoir as a reservoir that could release water back into the Delta. There's ways to do that. They've looked at it in the past, but this falls in line with the ability to export water when people in the Delta were overwhelmed with water, levees are overtopping. There is surplus water that could be exported. So if that gets put in San Luis, it could come back later in the year to help meet the Delta salinity standards. Because again, we're seeing the inability of our current reservoirs to get the job done. So I would hope you look at both of those and we'll comment on the draft when we see it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else in the room? Oh, see one hand up.
Hi, everyone. Justin Marsh. I'm here speaking on behalf of the UC Davis and UC Multiple Campus Research Project, the Just Transitions. I want to thank you, Luis, for plugging our project, and again, thanking the council here for the forum today. There's such a great crowd. I drove in from my remote session just to be here. It's really important to see the range of folks in the room, the range of constituents.
This is working, right?
So what I'd like to say is I would like to take this moment to plug our project, the Just Transitions. We are focused on convening and sort of in some ways piggybacking and enhancing the Delta Stewardship Council Salinity Management Workshop to move into a 3-year project in which we're posing the question, what if? And really what we're trying to do is give a forum for anybody and everybody that has lived experience and has thoughts on strategies for managing salinity and water quality in the Delta. And through this process, we're going to speculate on futures, potential futures, possible futures, and moving towards preferable futures. And the goal really is to have everyone have a seat at the table, to work with scientists and modeling experts to vet these potential futures and to continually rediscuss this information with publics, with experts, anyone that wants to be involved. So all that to say that I've got some information on our project. I'd love to share it with you. Anyone that is interested in taking part in our intake surveys and interviews, we're doing that now to generate some sort of baseline scenarios. I'd love to get your information and to share our project with you further. So thanks for your time. And again, Council, thank you for the platform.
Thank you, Justin. Anyone else in the room? Emma, do we have any comments online?
We do. We have a comment from Deirdre Desjardins. You should be able to speak now.
Yeah, Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I did want to say that there was a huge impediment to adapting to climate change. Climate change isn't the future. We're seeing it now with increased frequency of dry and critically dry years, and we've seen a huge increase in temperatures. I was stunned. It's like 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit in the Sacramento watershed and San Joaquin watershed. And the Department of Water Resources did an analysis in which they found a shift in runoff efficiency, which you would expect because evapotranspiration takes more water out of the watershed. But they said, we can't, it's too soon, we can't incorporate this into our state water, our calcium modeling. But if you look at the temperature increase, there was a huge step increase. The temperatures almost, the temperature change almost doubled over the past decade. So of course you would expect there to be this shift. And I'm concerned the Delta Science Program, in doing a review of DWR's assessment of hydrologic modeling, the Delta lead scientist convened it, and she did not convene a normal stakeholder group for a peer review. And nobody not had any input into the questions that were asked or the materials that were provided for reviews. So the current generation of calcium models that's being used simply doesn't incorporate it, and it's foundational for all of the modeling that DWR is doing, including the modeling for Delta Adapts. So I just want to point out the issue of equity of representation is also foundational to doing adequate modeling for climate change impacts. And I have found there is a tendency in agencies to not face inconvenient truths until, and delay it. And we can't afford delay now. Climate change impacts are accelerating, as we've seen over the past decade.
Thank you, Deirdre. Emma, anyone else online?
No.
And there's the dinger. Excellent. Okay, fantastic. Louise and Tom, I'd like to offer you can step down if you want from dais, or you can stay, whichever is most comfortable. But at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Delta Stewardship Council staff, Morgan Chow and Jeff Henderson.
Thank you. We are almost done, I promise. So we're going to turn our attention to funding and governance for a bit, and then summarize some of the next steps on the project, and then have our last round of input from the council members and the audience. So turning to funding, if we could bring the PowerPoint back up, please. So the basic story behind funding is actually a pretty basic one, which is the scale of investment needed over the next 30 years is greater than what we've historically been spending in the Delta. And our adaptation plan includes rough cost estimates, and it analyzes funding needs and potential financing mechanisms with a focus on the costs associated with ecosystem restoration and levee improvements that are associated with the impacts that the vulnerability assessment anticipates through 2050. We should note that when we talk about levee costs, we're focused on the cost associated with raising the levee crest to accommodate projected water level increases. And that's consistent with methodology employed in the vulnerability assessment. Those costs do not include bringing levees to Bulletin 19282 standards. Those estimates assume, our estimates assume that that is already done. Restoration costs, when we look at that side of the equation, include planning, design, permitting, and construction. And there's a diagram up on the screen. It's shown in the diagram, the gap between the existing sources and funding needs will need to be filled. Sorry, got a little sidetracked. Need to be filled with new or expanded funding sources, drawing upon mechanisms such as general obligation bonds, federal spending initiatives, and other creative financing mechanisms. One example pathway for new sources is illustrated on the funding row of this slide. One example pathway for new sources would be new federal climate change targeted spending, say in the range of $1 to $3 billion, water conveyance lease fees of about $1 to $1.5 billion, and property related tax revenues that could range anywhere from $73 million to $1.5 billion. Even with that, this still leaves us a funding gap of $6.1 billion. The plan will also detail the cost effectiveness of adaptation projects as it compares to taking no action and risking the value of the assets. This is done in part to describe the consequences of inaction and underscore the need to identify new sources of funding. So the takeaway, we need to come together to innovate how adaptation strategies can be funded so that there's regular, predictable funding streams that can support implementation. And this could take the form of a diverse portfolio of different resources, including taxes, bonds, public funding, private investment, and user fees. So I'll now hand it over to Morgan, who's going to address the governance portion of our presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. Next slide, please. So in addition to our various strategies that do touch on governance needs, our draft plan will have a separate chapter that addresses the unique history, challenges, and recommendations for adaptation governance in the Delta, as governance determines really the process for planning, funding, and implementing and managing adaptation. So the graphic here was developed by Tara Posey, who I was here this morning, but maybe I don't see her now. She's a Delta Science Fellow on UC Davis PhD candidate, and she's doing research on adaptation governance in the Delta. And so this is just a snapshot of a piece of her network map that she developed, which illustrates how climate collaboratives are connected in the Delta. And as you can see, the blue circle shows Delta Adapts, this initiative, which actually connects a significant portion of adaptation practitioners in the region, and that we hope that it will continue to as we move into implementation. Next slide. So just to briefly touch on some of the recommendations that will be in our plan, the first is around procedural justice and really thinking about the processes and decisions so that communities are represented and those most impacted can participate in decision-making processes. So we'll have best practices associated with participatory governance. The need to adopt an adaptive management framework, so adjusting policies and strategies based on environmental changes and evolving understandings of vulnerabilities and solutions, as Louise and others just touched on earlier today. And then lastly, we'll touch on exploring inroads for traditional knowledge and Delta science and decision-making, something that we talked about, that folks discussed yesterday at the council meeting as well. So that's just a very high-level glimpse at the governance component of our forthcoming plan. I'll hand it back over to Jeff.
So you may be asking, what is the council's potential role in all of this? Next slide, please. One of the things that the plan does is, among the actions that are identified, there are priority actions, things that are either underway or could be begun using existing resources or slight enhancements to existing resources. And the council's role in this adaptation plan is largely as convener and partner. However, there are a number of short-term priority actions that are being recommended as assigned to the council. And these include a number of things that we're already working on, others that could be added to future work plans, and partnerships with other agencies and community groups, which remain key to our success. And these include things like advancing representational justice and adaptation by building relationships with CBOs and tribes to better understand priorities and make projects more impactful. Using the council's communication resources to amplify communication on risk, restoration benefits, and adaptation options. Helping to fill research gaps through the Delta Science Program. Embracing other ways of knowing and traditional knowledge by working with tribes and tribal communities to interweave TK in adaptation work. Working through the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, or DPIC, to create a regional adaptation funding strategy. And advancing adaptation through our existing Covered Action Authority by continuing to encourage land use practices that enhance Delta resilience, that halt or reverse subsidence, that advance tidal wetland restoration on lands that are at intertidal elevations, and importantly, that reduce levee failure risk. And again, a lot of this is work that the council is already undertaking. Other things are things that could be added to our future work plans. And again, we rely on partnerships with organizations and other agencies to advance these causes. Next and final slide. Next steps. As we mentioned at the beginning, we've been working on the adaptation plan since 2021. We're getting very close to having a draft plan for public review in the early portion of this year. We'll aim to finalize the plan this summer. And input and comments we heard during this workshop will be considered as we complete these plans. Thank you for coming today. We recognize this has been a lot to absorb, a lot to question, and a lot to discuss. So we're just very appreciative to everyone for coming today. We've reached the end of our presentations and we're now ready for our final round of questions and discussion.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Any thoughts from council members to start? Chairman Dueño, I see your mic is on. I don't know.
You know, I started this this discussion with that first paragraph where it says we are very excited to spend the morning talking about our draft Delta Adapts Climate Adaptation Strategies, and having gone through the last few hours in listening and seeing the amount of engagement, the amount of passion and dedicated comments and questions and inquiries, this is exciting. This is very, very exciting work. I want to thank the staff. I think Morgan and Jeff, I think you've just done an outstanding job. Annie, thank you. I mean, I think that this really, for me, does cement, again, how critical this work is, how important this is going to unfold, and how it's going to affect not only our work, but everybody's work working in the Delta. So I'm really excited. I don't know if anybody else has anything else to share. I'm getting a little concerned because we're kind of down to the bare bones on our council.
Councilmember Lee, Councilmember Judge?
I'll say something. I had a huge learning curve when I got appointed to this council, and I've really appreciated the historical perspective that different folks have brought to this forum in particular. I did a lot of reading and a lot of research to prepare myself for this role. And I just want to acknowledge the complications of the strategy that we're putting forward, because it's layered upon years and years and years and years of water manipulation in California. And as Tom brought out, there are, multiple underlying issues regarding water. So this was no small feat, and I appreciate, the huge amount of effort, because we can't just throw up our hands and say that, it's unsolvable. Realize everything is going to be incremental progress, including, the funding issues that we're going to have. But I think this is a great start, and I really appreciate the public forum and the opportunity for all the different voices to come here and continue to help educate me, especially. So thank you.
Thank you. Judge, anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I have a very encouraging notion of that this is going to be a reality, and we are going to fight for it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, I'd now like to turn to our in-person audience. Is there anyone who would like to comment on the funding and governance panel specifically? Erin has her hand up.
Amber McDowell with the Sacramento County Farm Bureau. I just want to be interested to see where some of these projects are going to be implemented from, which is going to help determine some of the funding and stuff. But as we talk about increased costs, our farmers have really been bombarded a lot in the last decade or so with increase in costs. And so simply like raising property taxes or other things like that, it's going to be a little bit harder to do, and especially hitting beyond just them as an individual on their farm. It affects those farm workers. It affects the whole community. And so you're going to have to be creative and then also approach it very carefully too. A lot of people, farmers have not trusted the government so much. Right now, we're still trying to get funding from disaster funding from 2020 and 21 from federal government money, state money. People have gone out of business because they haven't been able to recoup things that they have been told that they will get, or to assistance. And they don't want the assistance in reality. They want to be self-reliant. And so there's a lot of distrust. Now, CDFA has done a really good job with their latest funding with SWEEP and Healthy Soils of at least being a little bit more proactive and actually staying on top of timelines and getting funding out there and opportunities. And I think you're really going to have to stress more of trying to find those opportunities. There are a lot that are excited and interested in the carbon farming aspect, but there is not much information out there or for individuals to go out and grasp that. It is mainly more for the huge businesses trading this idea, but that is not actually an implemented process or practice that's really there for any of the small growers. So there's a lot of work still to be done to bridge that gap.
Thank you, Amber. I really appreciate that. Anyone else in the room? Oh, I got a hand up in the front.
I just wanted to thank Morgan and Annie for regularly including the city of Antioch in meetings and keeping us abreast of what's going on. My name is Julie Hoswydovich. I'm the Environmental Resources Coordinator for the city of Antioch, and myself and my colleague Olivia Talley are here to work on our Climate Action and Resilience Plan, which we'll be updating again this year and incorporating a lot of the Delta Adapts and the vulnerability assessment into that plan. So we are really appreciative of the work that's been happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in the room? Emma, do we have any comments online?
We do. We have a comment from Deirdre Desjardins. You should be able to speak now.
Thank you. I did want to commend the Delta Stewardship Council for convening this effort. The Delta has really needed a comprehensive climate adaptation plan, and it's something the Office of Planning and Research is now facilitating all over the state. But you kind of pioneered that. I did want to say that as somebody who's participated in some of the technical focus groups, it's been frustrating that we can't get copies of the PowerPoints, and I listen to farmers. I work with farmers and fishing groups and a huge cross section of Delta stakeholders, and I understand their concerns, but I also want to be able to get them the information, educate them about the impacts, and I feel like this one workshop, it's good, but it's too short to really educate people, and particularly to have a sort of cross-stakeholder dialogue where there's you need to form lateral connections and have lateral learning, where the farmers and the government representatives and the Delta water districts and DWR all learn from each other and listen to each other. And this was really excellent, but there's so much that's happening with climate change in the Delta right now that it's sort of not enough to convey the information. So I wanted to encourage you to think about that, and more broadly to think about the Delta Science Program work groups, none of which meet publicly, none of which publish an agenda, and the fishing and NGO community that I work with, a lot of them aren't included. I was just, the Delta Adapts salinity requirement. I got a salinity management effort. I got a lot of inquiries from colleagues, and they just, until the Just Transition folks reached out to them, none of them had been asked for their input. And I started going around and asking folks in the Delta, and people just hadn't been contacted. So the other issue too is make sure if you think you have somebody who's representing a constituency, make sure you clarify who they're actually in contact with, because it's too easy. People get busy. People may just want to represent a community without getting back to them and talking to them, but it's a way to not have real learning from the actual experience. I listen to people. I've learned to listen to everybody, and I spent 6,000 hours in the water fix hearing listening to testimony from every single person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'd also like to just call for a general public comment on this item, this agenda item in general, the whole day. Is there anyone who feels they have a leftover comment they would like to make at this juncture on the agenda item as a whole in the room? Okay, seeing none, do we have any additional comments online?
Deirdre Desjardins, your hand is still up. Would you like to make an additional public comment?
No, that's okay. I think I got it. Thank you very much. And I do really appreciate the enormity of this effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn it back to our chair, Virginia Madueño, at this time for closing statements.
Thank you again to all of our presenters, to all of our team. Great job. This now brings us to our last and final comment, preparation for the next council meeting. The next council meeting will take place on April 25th at the Oakley Recreation Center in Oakley, California. Please refer to the posted meeting notice 10 days before the meeting notice. Thank you to our new friends from Antioch. We like going to Monica's Riverview. I look forward to taking the Amtrak to our next council meeting and stopping by and paying a little A little respect to Monica's review. Daniel, thank you so much. Everybody,
Thank you.
drive safe and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.